Will this work? Will
There
I
you go.
have audio? It's the first question.
Oh, Max came.
Max.
That's Max, by the way. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Hey guys. All right.
Hi, Max.
Hi.
We
Have you-
just went live.
Oh, okay. So, what's this all about then?
This
You're
is
gushing
just...
over Chesterton. We both had a man crush on him.
It's just a normal, philosophy discussion. So the topic is restrained to philosophy, but other than that, it's free reign, according to Barney. That he said, right?
More or
Unless
less. Let's try to pick a topic. But so I'm a philosophy layman. I came into GDC about 6 months ago, and I ran into the term ontology, and I didn't know what it is. I did have philosophy in high school and stuff like that, but in all of these debates and interactions, I've kind of got really, really interested, and I find that there aren't enough hangouts where people actually go through what it means and go through the arguments. Like, people who know usually just name drop things and leave it at that. People who don't know. And
There's a great philosophical problem known as the problem of learning, known as the paradox of learning, which is related to what you're saying.
yeah, and I would like to, if possible, find some in between there. So if we're going to talk about something, to kind of try to explain and justify the things that are there. I don't have a set topic. What's that? Contemporary metaphysics.
I was going to read the thing on ontology in here to put it on the table for you if you want.
Go ahead.
It's really brief. Ontology is the theory of what kinds of things exist. That's it.
Yeah.
Dang. That is the simplest definition of ontology I've ever heard.
Same here. Usually it's something like...
Usually to refer to a philosopher's claimed inventory of what kinds of things exist.
Yeah.
I mean, I like that definition too, because I like relative identity. I like sortal terms and stuff like that. So it's like kinds. Mm-hmm. Ooh, sorts. I like that. That's right.
You believe in holes?
Correct definition of ontology.
I like how it's not too abstract. Like, usually I define it as as the study of being or something of the like, but that's even a little too abstract for a lot of people.
Let's see what this says.
So I know it as the study of what what things are. Of what things are, as opposed to epistemology of how we can know things, and I don't know, teleology, what things are for.
Teleology is usually put within philosophy. Well, metaphysics, I guess you could distinguish ontology and teleology. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but if you think about that, what things are, well, what? That's like quid est, right? It relates to the sort, right? When you say, what is this? You say it's such and such. It's a, what is this? It's a pen. Well, what is a pen? It's a sort of thing. It's a kind. It's an artificial kind, but it's a kind. So ontology is the study of kinds. So those two definitions of what is, study of what things are versus the study of kinds of things, they're interchangeable. They imply each other. So there's actually that's also,
of course, they have to be complementary, but
yeah. Well, I mean, some people. The thing about philosophy is that there's a meta field to every field, and which is basically the way that all the other fields interact. And so in meta ontology, there is the semantics of ontology, and what that could include, technically speaking, is what is ontology, and or what does it mean? And people can disagree on that. So
the ontology of ontology.
Well, I mean, there's that as no. It's the semantic. It's well, yeah, that's funny. But there is the ontology. What is ontology? What is it that we're doing?
That would be meta ontology.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Meta-ontology.
Yep.
But the meta-ontology isn't just the ontology of ontology. It's also all the other fields of ontology. So the ethics of ontology, the semantics of ontology, and so on and so forth. But it would also include, yes, but your meta-ontology will differ depending on your tradition and whatnot. So Same thing with your metaphilosophy. His question is, what is philosophy? That's a metaphilosophical question, and people disagree. And the fact that, and if people disagree, that means it means that philosophy isn't one thing. Philosophy is legion, as it were.
Yeah, of course. So on philosophy,
published on that
What?
not too long ago. There was a book published on that not too long ago, edited by Chalmers, called Meta Philosophy.
There needs to be a
meta philosophy.
Yep.
It's
It's essentially the discussion of what philosophy is. And in case you want to know what else, now that's debatable too, in which case you get into the area of meta philosophy. But yeah.
how to do meta philosophy properly.
Exactly.
You see, metaphilosophy is a subfield, depending on your metaphilosophy.
Here we go.
Metaphilosophy is a subfield of philosophy, and depending on your metaphilosophy, metaphilosophy is a subfield of metaphilosophy, which in turn may be a subfield of philosophy. So, yeah.
So here's ontology from Simon Blackburn's thing. You guys probably heard of this thing.
You have too many good books. I wish I had all your books.
I really appreciate that you're putting them on camera so that I know how the authors are spelled and what the name of the book is.
I won't take credit for anything. I stand on everybody's shoulders. It says, derived from the Greek word for being. So that's what Max was saying.
Mm-hmm.
But a 17th century coinage for the branch of metaphysics that concerns itself with what exists. Apart from the ontological argument itself, there have been many a priori arguments, blah, 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 blah. He's going to go into the argument. Such arguments, blah, blah, blah. Then he starts going into the ontological argument. I don't know why I did that. Quine's principle of ontological commitment is that to be is to be the value of a bound of variable. A principle not telling us what things exist, but how to determine what things a theory claims to exist. These are the things the variables range over in a properly regimented formal presentation of the theory. So philosophers characteristically charge each other with reifying things improperly. And in the history of philosophy, every kind of thing will at one time or another have been thought to be the fictitious result of an ontological mistake. That is the entry on ontology.
So and the interesting thing about that is that consequently you have various times in the history of philosophy, certain fields of philosophy were completely ignored. So there's even logic, right? Like this was even true. Like there was a great fault, but specifically metaphysics, over and over again, you'll find certain, like especially in the Enlightenment, you have people just like crapping on metaphysics. So Hume.
And here, I don't know if you heard this guy, Socratic logic, but Peter Kreeft.
I know Peter Kreeft.
He's got a fallacy in here called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
I actually have that
You
book.
have it too, Max. I've been wanting this book.
You have
It's
the
in my
latest
list of books that I want.
I have edition 3.1.
That's the one I want. This is the first one. There's all kind of typos in here. I want that one so bad. What's different in there?
I haven't read the first edition to tell you.
Oh, dang it.
Let's see. It's subdivided into 3 sections. Well, but yeah, actually it's subdivided into multiple sections. One on terms, the other on acts of the mind and understanding. So there he delves into.
Yep, I have that. Yep.
He goes on. He holds a huge. Yeah, he has a section on fallacies, material fallacies.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
He then goes to a section of definitions. The second act of the mind, judgment, changing propositions, contradiction. The third act of the mind of reasoning, different kinds of arguments, syllogisms, checking syllogisms for validity, more difficult syllogisms, compound syllogisms, induction, some practical applications of logic, some.
Why are we bringing this up?
Oh, and then he has an appendix.
Comparing diversions.
I brought it up because he has a fallacy in here called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is kind of relevant to the reifying thing. That's on 109 on my book. And he says, the concepts in metaphysics are very abstract. These abstractions, such as being, causality, and essence, are usually expressed by nouns. Nouns also express concrete individual things. It's easy to confuse these two kinds of nouns and treat an abstraction as if it were a concrete reality. And this is a fallacy that was coined by Whitehead, he says. And that goes to Blackburn's concern about reifying things in that other passage we read.
Right. Yeah. In my book, that's on page 111. By the way, do you have the appendix section where he gives out some problems with mathematical logic?
Is that Trent Dotery?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I've met him. He's hilarious. He actually, we had to host a philosophy conference at graduate school where we had to introduce him at a conference. He was having a debate with Jerry Walls. But yeah, everybody who, like my professor, we had to read this one for class there. What is mathematical logic? And that passage is pretty much laughed at by everybody who's a logician. But I don't know why we didn't get that far. But it's not taken seriously. They buy that Kraft book for the undergrads. But
oh yeah, I mean, I think Kraft's book is pretty good for
Oh, it's awesome. I love that.
I think that
Me too. I'm a humanities student by
Cool.
Yeah, so I really like spelling out logic in the longhand, even though I do know how to do the formal stuff, at least the first order formal stuff.
Oh, the formal stuff is absolute torture.
It is.
I died a little bit. Well, because I don't have the temperament for it. Like I had a guy in the class with me that would actually help me out.
I do have a temperament for it.
Non-classical logic, awesome. We had a.
I love this book. I have not. I finished half of it. Like it's split.
This is the one we had to do.
Technical. Ooh. Yeah, I bought this. This is.
I actually have some of my homework
I
saved.
basically haven't read anything past here. Maybe around here, but I've read most of it. I like.
Yeah, I'll pull up. I'll screen share. I'll show you my final exam real quick. It was awful.
My only objection to formal logic is that it's not. I think linguistic pragmatics screws with it a bit. Like it's not good at context. I'm sure you can do it. I'm sure that there's a convergence of the two fields. Because like if I have a book on linguistic pragmatics that I so pragmatics. It does have some logical notation in it. So I suspect that there is probably a way of mixing, like maybe there's some way of using modal logic to explain context. But
here's my constructing a model. That's one problem.
Dang.
It was annoying. Let me see here. What is this? This is all part of the final exam. I mean, it was just brutal. It took us like 2 weeks to do. But
What is it?
that's my logic final exam in graduate school.
Yep. Logic gets very mathematical the higher up you go.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I remember once speaking to my logic professor. The dude, he does a lot of work on artificial intelligence, computer science, and applying logic to it.
When I love logic, yeah.
Yeah, when I told him I actually liked doing the longhand Aristotelian sort of logic, he said, "Well, you could forget all that here. We're studying actual logic. The stuff you're doing is like the equivalent."
Well, that's not fair.
Yeah,
that's not fair.
He said it was the equivalent of taking alchemic logic and putting it into a chemistry setting.
Yeah. The funny thing about that is that the medieval logicians have discovered most of the stuff that modern logicians already. There was actually so the age of reason is actually a great age of the fall of knowledge of logic. Because there was a period. So Graham Priest, the guy who wrote this book, right? Graham Priest, great logician. He's a strange guy. He's like a Buddhist or something, but or at least he's inclined towards Buddhism. But he's a genius. And he talks about these 3 periods of time of logical development. But he also talks. He asked this interesting question of like whether logic can be changed, and he says that you have to ask that on 3 things: logica ens, logica docens, and logica docens, logica utens, and logica ens. Roughly speaking, what the logic that we teach, the logic that we do, and logic in its own self. And the logic that we teach can and does change. And in fact, in the history, and a major point that he makes out is that in the medieval period, there was a fall, right? So the scholastics were actually going over an advance in logic similar to the last 100 years. And by the way, in the last 100 years, there was this major advance in logic, which is why his professor was inclined to say that, because in truth, in the last 100 years, this happened. But but there was a great fall, and so you have a lot of modern logicians reading old medieval logicians and saying, "Oh, yeah, Russell was talking about that." This is what Russell was talking about. Oh, it's nearly 1,000 years old. We're just rediscovering stuff. It's like,
although he gets a lot of crap from a lot of Thomists and more metaphysically inclined Catholic thinkers, William of Ockham was one hell of a logician in his time.
William of Ockham is awesome.
Yeah, I haven't read anything.
This is really good. You want to get this on universals? He goes over Occam, Duns Scotus, Abelard, Boethius, and Porphyry.
Did I mention that I don't have money?
Oh crap! That's right. I'm sorry.
Well,
I have like many of the books that you have. I have on my wish list. That one's not even there. I bet that's got one of those $100 books or something like.
By the way, if you want some of those books, I can lend it to you from my library. The link is above.
Oh, awesome!
Oh, cool.
Just type in the book that you're looking for in the library, and I'm sure you can find a good link to that.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Thanks, man.
Not a problem.
Thank you very much.
Well, what I'm here for.
Yeah, So I actually tried to get on a while back. I had an offer of something like this before. I'll shut up. This is not relevant. We're talking way too much in like text right now. Barney said he wants to like actually lay out the stuff.
What are we laying out?
Like I feel that
I thought we got it. He just wanted to know what ontology was, right?
Yeah, we ended up referencing like 1,000.
So yeah, I mean, we could talk about philosophy as a general field. We could talk about areas in philosophy. Hope we didn't chase him off. Oh, there he is. Hey, Barney. If you like, we could talk about philosophy as a general subject or specific areas in philosophy, like ethics, metaphysics, logic, any area that you'd like to know more of.
So since this is the first stream, well, on one end, I'm really enjoying watching you gush and compare books, and yeah,
Gosh.
I'm really. You are gushing. Come on, look at this book. Oh, come on.
Oh no, I didn't deny it. I like your choice of words.
That's what we. That's it.
I like watching people do stuff with enthusiasm, especially when they're doing the stuff that I'm also enthusiastic about. But no, we don't need to go anything specific. We started off with ontology. I don't mind if we go down that route. The question that fair enough. Let's go somewhere a bit more specific. In model logic, there is a concept of possible worlds, which I'm not sure makes much sense to me. What are the restrictions on possible worlds? What separates a possible world from an impossible world?
So traditionally, it's essentially. I'll just tackle it first and pick up where I'm failing. A possible world is one that is internally consistent. That means there is no contradiction in setting up some of its various descriptors. Like, imagine a possible world where the only thing that exists is a unicorn and a piece of toast. There's nothing illogical about that. There's no contradiction. But if I was to say, imagine a possible world where all objects were Euclidean, but parallel lines intersected. There's a contradiction there, because in Euclidean geometry, one of the axioms is parallel lines don't intersect, and yet we have shapes where parallel lines would intersect. So that's a world that couldn't happen.
So it's basically only defined by contradictions, right?
No, that's necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, one way of defining possible world is a maximally consistent set of propositions. So
Maximal. That's the key word. Maximal description.
maximal means that
nothing's left out.
yeah, for any two propositions, the assertion and its negation, either the assertion or the negation is in the set. So you have the set of propositions. You're not going, and if the language in which the whatever it is called is capable of articulating a proposition A or not A, one of them has to be in the set.
Like
and also
Plantinga
consequently, the other is going to be false anyway. But what'd you say?
Yeah, Plantinga calls it a book.
Yeah, like I don't actually like that view of possible worlds, because I think the possible world is that it's the I take a truth maker view. So the possible world isn't the position.
I hate truth maker theory. I wrote a whole paper against truth maker theory. Have you ever read Trent Merrick's?
I have not.
He's got a book called Truth and Ontology, and it's a ruthless refutation of truth maker theory.
I'll be honest. I'm just going to be honest here. I'm not a proponent of the pragmatic theory of truth, but one thing I actually did like about it was it doesn't deal with truth makers, at least not that I'm aware of.
I don't know what you guys are talking about. This is where college students and laymen like myself begin to diverge.
So is it truth maker theory in general that you're objecting to, or is it just specific forms of it?
Let me read this real quick.
Before you proceed, can somebody lay out the truth maker theory?
Truth maker theory, you can do it, Max.
Truth supervenes on being.
Essentially, for every proposition, there is some fact of the matter that makes such a proposition either true or false, but there are some that just require it for only positive things rather than negative things. So there are various different ways of formulating it. So you can do it counterfactually. If such a thing, like such a set of conditions make a proposition true, such that if that those things didn't exist, that proposition would have been false. That's one way of spelling it out.
Yeah, exist is a key word.
Mm-hmm.
Has to exist. Truth supervenes on being.
Exactly.
But just
the truth maker is the being which the truth subsists upon.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. So the truth bearer is the thing which in fact has the truth, and the truth exists given that there is a truth bearer with a truth maker. Sorry, I'm just not understanding why
you could actually affirm that with a certain subclass of propositions, but if you want to make it a necessary and sufficient condition for all types of propositions, that's something called truth maker maximalism, which that's what I would argue against. I think truth makers play a role sometimes.
What I want to say is that even the logical system itself has a truth maker, and that's the nature of all reality. So even logical truth.
I would say it's the mind of God. That's the ground.
Well, yeah. Well, that might be ultimately what I mean by it. Yeah, but still, you have a truth maker theory. It's like it still works.
It's not truth maker maximalist though.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
Does maximalism have like ontological commitments that would deny theism or something? Or is
it just says that there are some things that are true that don't need a truth maker?
I mean, if you're a Molinist, for example, you would have to believe that there are...
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So, for example, Molinists don't believe that counterfactuals are grounded in any particular truth maker.
Well, couldn't they be grounded in powers?
That's what Leftow tries to do. I disagree with the way he gets there, though. But you don't have to. There's other theories.
Yeah,
there's a book called God Necessity, but Leftow, he tries to do it that way.
Like powers themselves aren't counterfactuals, but the counterfactuals. So the powers are what the counterfactuals supervene upon. Yeah. But you would ground the truth. Like the power would be the truth maker, and thereby you would get both. You would get whatever. Yeah, you understand what.
And it assumes that omniscience is a power. That's controversial too. Some don't think omniscience is a power. It's more of a state.
Divine simplicity. I'm inclined. I'm not a theist, but if I were to be a theist,
Max would like that. I don't like it.
I am a divine. Yeah, I am a classical theist of the Scotus variety.
Yeah, I don't.
Professor is pushing me. Professor's pushing me over there.
I want to go. I have my professor's books.
Oh, if you like the notion of divine,
my dear Scholastic Introduction to Scholastic Method.
If you are,
I want to get that.
Oh, it's a good book then.
Get it.
It's in my
I want
This is
that.
one of the best books ever written.
It's in my wish list.
Yeah.
it's in my, MJ. If you
Oh,
want,
Max, can I ask you a quick question?
yes, the book is in my library. You could just.
Sweet. You are awesome. Did you see Carrier's response?
It was so laughably stupid.
I'm so glad you're here right now. Go ahead. Rant.
Oh.
Carrier's awful, man. That guy sucks. I swear. I'm sorry. I know we're live. I don't care.
This is a. I mean, this is a.
Rights is so condescending. It's
Oh,
so
I
annoying.
mean, this is a man who, for quite some time, objected to the Big Bang Theory, even when actual cosmologists were like, "No, it's a thing." This
It's the
is a
best
man
explanation of the evidence, but for now.
right?
But just what he was saying about how he didn't understand, that Phaser didn't understand something. I forget exactly, like a causal category or something.
He said Phaser didn't understand the Aristotelian notion of universals. This is a man who has written on it fairly extensively, and he even gave reputations Carrier didn't even touch. Like, for example, how does the Aristotelian answer universals for fictional entities like unicorns, or even numbers like 0 that clearly do not have a universal, or even imaginary numbers like the square root of -1. Like that, it's impossible, and yet our universal theory should incorporate that. Not addressed by Carrier, and he said that Phaser couldn't read. Honestly,
I'm actually going to pull it up right now because I want to pinpoint exactly what he's doing here.
I don't remember why we got off this topic. What were we talking about before?
Possible worlds.
We're talking about truth making.
We were talking. Is he?
Possible worlds for you, Barney. I was going to read this for you. I thought this was pretty well. A possible world is a way the world might be. One can think of a possible world as a maximal description of reality. Nothing is left out. It may be thought of as a maximal state of affairs, which includes every other state of affairs or its complement, or as an enormous conjunction composed of every statement or its contradictory. These state of affairs or statements must be compossible, that is, able to obtain together, or to be true together, otherwise they would not constitute a possible world. Moreover, such a maximal state of affairs must be actualizable, or capable of being actual. Just what that means is unclear. Some philosophers take actualizability to mean strict logical possibility, mere freedom from contradiction, which was brought up before. Others demur regarding such an understanding of actualizability is far too generous. To borrow planning as example, the statement the prime minister is a prime number is strictly logically consistent, but such a state of affairs is not actualizable because nobody's going to vote for a prime number. Planning prefers to construe actualizability in terms of broad logical possibility, a notion that he leaves undefined but merely illustrates. The situation is further complicated by the hypothesis of theism, for if God's existence is necessary, then some worlds which seem intuitively to be broadly logically possible may not be actualizable, after all, because God necessarily would not actualize them. For example, a world in which human beings all freely reject God's plan of salvation and fail to reach heaven seems to be broadly logically possible, but it may not be actualizable because God is essentially too good to actualize such a world, aside from Calvinists. Such problems have led some thinkers to differentiate between broadly logical possibility and metaphysical possibility or actualizability. In any case, these debates make clear that possible world semantics do not explain or ground our modal notions, but at best illustrate them. I thought that was a pretty good explanation.
Barney,
it goes on.
More or less. Related to possible worlds, there are notions of contingent and necessary objects. A necessary object would have to exist in all possible worlds.
Not necessarily.
Oh, go ahead.
There's another distinction in the literature, which Max probably knows about, Frank, but
I don't.
There's necessity de dicto and necessity de re.
Oh, right.
And necessity de dicto is the necessity attributed to a proposition that is true in all possible worlds. Necessity de re is the necessity of a thing's possessing a certain property, or in other words, a thing's having a property essentially. So I don't exist in all possible worlds,
which
but
this-
perhaps I exemplify the property of being human in all the worlds in which I exist. So that's necessity D-Ray.
which
instead of
allows for
speak
there to be
dicta.
worlds that exist.
Right. So a way of thinking about that is there's no possible world where Barack Obama is a doorknob.
Exactly.
There are possible worlds in which he doesn't exist, but there are no possible worlds in which he's a doorknob. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why not?
Because it is part and part. What? Because it has to do with. Are you actually seriously asking that question?
No.
Okay, sorry. I'm like. I take,
It is a good.
But I would let you
Good
explain
question.
if you want to.
I know.
It is a good question. There's so one way of explaining it is by way of just saying by appealing to some form of essentialism, where there's something that is essential about who you are, that if it wasn't part and parcel with you, that thing wouldn't be you. So
Or Hoxades.
yeah, exactly. Like for example, water and being H2O. That's something we've discovered. Water is H2O. It's an empirical thing. And if that is the case, that these two things are inextricably linked, then it would follow that there's no possible world where water consists of X, Y, Z.
That's the Putnam thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that would be what Kripke was talking about, a posteriori necessary truths. Because everybody thought up till Kripke that necessary truths had to be a priori. And he was like, nope. Same with Hesperus and Phosphorus.
I actually once talked to a university professor of mine, brought up that specific example. He said, "Oh well, you're conflating two different things: water, as it's understood in the laboratory kind of setting, and water as it's used in our everyday setting. And water
and intention. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's how he gets around it because he loves, a strict analytic synthetic distinction.
So,
I mean, I agree with
one
it
of
too.
those senses, water could exist as non-H2O, but in another it couldn't.
As an extension.
Yeah. In one sense, water is H2O is part of it, but not the whole of it. I guess, extensionally speaking. I think is that right? I might be wrong.
The extensions are different because in twin world, as Putnam would put it, the extension of water is XYZ instead of H2O, but the intentions could be identical.
I'm talking about Max's professor. He says that in a scientific laboratory, water and H2O are interchangeable, but outside of that, water is just it's phenomenological, I suppose.
In this world, I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah. For somebody who's not acquainted with the underlying chemistry or whatever.
Exactly. I've actually used that as a way of objecting to moral naturalists who usually like using that as a way of synthesizing identity. So, for example, a natural property and a moral property, according to a moral naturalist, could be identical in the same sense as H2O is water. And I brought up that's not necessarily the case. So it could be the case that, for example, using Putnam, there's a world where they have a certain intentionality when it comes to morality. We do, and when you scratch the surface, it's a whole different moral property. In which case, you have to say it's either definitionally true, in which case it's trivial again, or or you say it's an empirical matter, which of these two are the real one, in which case you haven't really solved it.
Yeah.
Barney's view actually lets him say that. Barney's he's an evolutionary
Moral theorist?
Yeah. He connects it with the selfish gene and stuff. It's actually very interesting.
I see.
So
Barney, is this true?
It's
Barney.
Evolutionary metaethics.
No, I actually like Barney's view. I think that the only issue with it is that God doesn't exist. And so the only issue with Barney's view is epistemological in my mind. Like I think his view is largely
but my view doesn't necessitate that God doesn't exist. It just
like the reason
God.
I'm not saying it's not a problem. So the thing is, if God exists, you could say that he ordered the world in such a way that
exactly
those things would work out. And so you could the epistemological problems that you and I had, which is like roughly, you can't. We just got to pick a side ultimately, and I'm on the abortion side, and you're on the I'm sorry, I'm on the pro-life side, and you're on the you're on the
pro-choice. Okay.
Side. In your view, there's an ambiguity there. That there's a you can't tell, right? Ultimately, it's we pick a side and we see how society works out. And
it will be decided post fact by the outcomes of the process.
But if God existed, you could have his revelation, and you could have like the Catholic Church telling you that it's wrong, and so you would know. Well, you have the infallible statements of the Catholic Church saying that it's wrong, or a fair inference from the Bible saying that it's wrong, and so you know from the source that the way it's gonna work out ain't gonna be good. So
in my view, it couldn't be that God. It couldn't be the God that prescribes morality, but it could be a God which set things up so as a morality outcomes out of it, right?
Yeah, but you can have both. You can have a God who sets things up and prescribes it precisely because
you can have a God who prescribes it by setting it up to enable an outcome if that God is
the reason God prescribes it is because he set it up first. So the morality is already the morality is already inherent in your system, right? And I agree. I actually think your system works, right? Like I think that's actually
we're talking about it without ever presenting it, and they don't know what we're talking
about. Okay,
so I should present it.
Well, we've been doing that to you for a little while, so
that's fair enough. I've been catching up. It's basically a system of metaethics where the theory of the selfish gene kind of describes that the genes which promote their spreading will spread and therefore be more present in the subsequent population. So what defines the presence of genes is that accidental property of them being conducive to their spreading. And that kind of automatically gives you familiar relations and concepts such as love and those prime emotional states, where you have your child, which has 50% of your genes, and if your genes are conducive to their spreading, they will automatically be. One of the ways they can do it is by forcing you to support your child, because your child will spread that gene further. And
so roughly. Okay, sorry.
Your level of affection for people is due to how many genes you share under the selfish gene hypothesis. And I'm just taking that a little step further and saying, well, it would also be conducive if you, I don't know, for example, if you behaved altruistically, if you spread your genes by helping others, they might feel grateful and want to give back. And if they can't give back to you, they'll give back to your children. So that feeling of love and sharing or friendship or altruism will then start extending beyond the people that share your genes to the people that influence the people that share your genes. And you will have an emergence of instincts purely from chemistry, that some actions will be considered good or bad, or you will have an instinctive repulsion to them or an instinctive attraction to them because they affect the society you live in and the environment in which your genes spread. Am I making any sense?
Yeah. Although let's see.
It's better than you guys think. It actually works out. Like the way he's articulated it, you might have a couple of. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to raise one. Could I raise an objection to this?
I can defend you against any objection you put forth.
Go
Go ahead.
Somebody's
All
calling
right.
me.
In light of cultural variation, though, how do you know that? Sorry, in light of cultural variation, how do you know where morality has evolved to a point where the morality of two different populations doesn't really overlap that much? For example, you might have it that you're part of a group A who thinks that stuff we find objectionable, like cannibalization or some other gross thing, is perfectly acceptable. And at which case we could say, oh, they just evolved differently from we've done. In which case it's right for them and not for us.
So the idea is that morality is not the cause of things that are good and bad. It's the consequence of what works. We have the feeling that they're good at. That your morality is defined for you. It is objective, but it's not universal, right? When you look at that other society, you see their actions as bad, and from your perspective, they are truly objectively bad. But from the perspective of a person in that society, it would be good, right? It's not such that there is a universal morality that can be applied equally to everybody, or that you say, oh, they just evolved differently, so it's good for them.
All right.
Right?
Okay.
You see it as bad, therefore from your perspective it's bad, and all that exists are those perspectives.
And the morality that wins out is right.
By consequence of surviving, by its own evolutionary process, right?
Honestly, this strikes me as being one of the horns in Euthyphro's dilemma, except the one where God just dictates whatever morality is at some present time. And of course, that strikes me, a lot of people, as being arbitrary in that context. And yet, when it's evolution that's doing it, by means of natural selection, that strikes me as being, well, just as arbitrary.
Well, so that's not quite true, because the condition is that the whole species actually has to survive. If the whole species ends up dying out, then somebody went wrong somewhere, because the whole
but if they did die out though, would they have
That's the point, which means they were wrong. No one learns it.
the chemical setup, the biological setup, which set their ground state, their instincts, their urges, their revulsions, was such that it caused them to disappear. Therefore, that setup is not there. Therefore, that morality that emerges from those instincts is also no longer there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing which is the one that works. So the question that I was most asked about this was, let's say the example of rape. Everybody agrees that rape is bad. Well, no, not everybody. Rapists think that rape is good for them, right? They know it's bad in societal context. They know there is some wrong there. They know that they have to hide it because they will be punished, and that will stop their propagation and success, and might have an effect on their progeny. But they have an urge, they have an instinct that they should do it, that they're compelled to do it, right? So from his perspective and his perspective alone, it's a good thing. From my perspective, it's a bad thing. If it is a good thing, after a while, not if it is a good thing, if it's successful, if it helps him reproduce, if it helps his progeny reproduce further, if it spreads out and becomes an overarching a majority opinion, a majority instinct, then it really will be good for those people, for that majority of people, right? By consequence, by by merely working out.
So there's like a good for individuals and there's good for the groups, but like there's there's good relative to the individual, but then there's good relative to the group. The thing is, like, this is what I talked with him about. There's what are they called? Causal loops. They're feedback loops, so that the good of the individual is related to the good of the group, and the good of other species are related to the good of. Sorry if I'm going to. I was.
Wouldn't it also suffer from Moore's some of the objections to other naturalistic theories, like take Moore's naturalistic fallacy? If one says that the good is, that which helps us survive, or something along the line, or that which is evolutionary beneficial, doesn't that render goodness to be trivial? Does it?
No.
In some way, I would actually say yes. It's trivial, but it's compelling.
No, but I would
Go ahead. Huh?
What I'm like it's. So, I don't want to defend your view for you, but like, so the way I think he could take something like we were talking about it earlier, synthetic
a priori,
something like that. The point is that, like you say, God is the good, but it's not trivial because semantically they're different, but extensionally they're the same. You could say that this is his meta ontology. So it's like the good is like, this is what the good is, but what we mean by good differs in any given situation, and that's actually explained by his goodness relative to the individual. This is why I keep saying it's good for you, right? To you it's good, but to another person it might not be, right? The good in any given instance is different than that which grounds the fact that it's good. But the good in any given instance ultimately is related to and grounded to the evolutionary survival because of these causal feedback loops and whatnot. So in a sense that resolves the issue. I think, at least.
Maybe this will work better. Let's try to define the concepts of good and evil from this perspective. So, to reproduce, to spread my genes, I need to gain resources, whether it's food, time, money, control over other people, right? Favors that they can do for me. And those are the things that will help me spread my genes. I can accomplish those things in two ways. I can steal that money. I can kill my competition, and I can kill my neighbors and take their stuff, and I will gain some resources. I will gain a certain kind and a certain amount of resources, which actually can help me reproduce. But what I will do in that process is also make enemies, make people who will seek out to destroy me, who will seek out to reciprocate and punish me or take my stuff, or because I'm a danger to them. And if they cannot reciprocate on me, they will reciprocate on my kind, on my children, on my family, right? So that thing is beneficial for me in the short term, but bad in the long term for the spreading of my genes. And such a thing I would have an urge to do it to some degree, but I would have also an understanding that such a thing is evil, and that the only way I could ever benefit from it is if I got away with it. On the other hand, if there's a way for me to gain resources by helping people around me, so that when they reciprocate, they help me, help my children, help my family, then that thing will be beneficial for me in the short term and in the long term, and will actually be conducive to spreading those genes that create that urge in me so much further. And those things will be seen, will eventually become seen as truly good, as something that is to be aspired to, something that you not only have the urge to do, but that it's a good thing to advertise it. Look, I'm doing this. I'm the kind of person that a society would like to support and help, and that deserves their reciprocation in that way, right?
Okay, all right. I think I follow you on that one. How well?
Can I invite somebody? Can I
No.
just?
Sure.
I'm kidding. Yeah, sure. How would you get across the is-ought gap though? Like, okay, I realize that this is helpful for my evolutionary survival, but why ought I do that? My genes kind of compel me to also have children, but if I don't want that, my genes can go jump in a lake, as Steven Pinker said. I recognize that some things have evolutionary advantages for me and others, but just because that is the case doesn't mean I ought to pursue it.
Yeah. So under that system, there is no independent morality. There an objective observer and an outside object. So if there was a God there looking at us, he would see nothing moral or immoral in any of our actions or in any of our choices, right? There is no independent morality. Morality is exclusively internal to the biological unit.
Huh. Oh, okay. So if it's completely internal, then wait, how can it be a group thing if it's internal? Groups are external to the individual, not internal.
So, if it's internal to me that I find, so if it's internal to me that I help my brother, right?
Right.
And I help my brother and he helps me because we share this, let's say we share the same genes. We have children. There's more of them. And they all have that urge internal to them to help those groups that help each other in such a way would outperform those biological units that don't have that urge, that don't want to help their brother, that want to do it on their own, that want to, right?
Right.
So that's an explanation of a single instance. Now, it could have turned out the other way around. And for some animals, it does turn out the other way around, that working in groups doesn't work for them, and that working as an individual brings them an advantage. So when you look at sharks, when you look at large predators, where a large group would have huge issues with finding enough food to feed the group, and they just occasionally meet to mate, but outside of that, they live out solitary lives because one animal per some area can get enough food. From their perspective, in their world, in their urges, in their genetic setup of instincts, it is perfectly moral not to behave as social animals, right?
All right, but the question is, so I recognize that we have this internal urge. That's a fact. I can recognize that we benefit from it in a group setting, but from those two those two descriptors, how do we get the normative statement? Therefore, we ought to follow that internal urge, or we ought to increase our progeny.
Probably have to collapse it down to prudential reasons, which aren't moral.
Unless you want to go into some kind of pragmatic theory of truth, in which case
he can make a distinction between the good and the just, and he can relativize the just to its society. So, like this particular society has its particular system of rules, and so you ought to do it in this. So obligation is obligation is in one sense society relative, and in one sense it's based on the good. Because you could speak of like a higher order obligation. The right obligation is the one which actually ultimately will work out. The right obligation is the successful strategy. It's like, so there's actually a game theoretic way of looking at his view, which is why I like his view. But
again,
that's just descriptive ethics, though.
There is what?
That's
like descriptive ethics.
It's descriptive.
It doesn't have to be like so.
Like this, like I can understand how this might make a pretty good normative ethical theory in the sense of something like a Hobbesian contractual theory, but based off of evolutionary psychology. But on the meta-ethical level, there doesn't seem to be anything objective about what we ought to do. It just seems to come down to group preferences.
So if you ought to do what you are compelled to do.
How does that follow?
Yeah, ought implies can, right?
Yeah.
Ought implies
you can do what you're compelled to do. You are in fact able to do what you are compelled.
Well, that equivocates on can a little bit, but can usually means that you can do the opposite of whatever's compelling you to do it. So compulsion by definition.
Okay, let's contrast it to some other
possibilities.
So if a part of me ends up in a flame, I will have the instinct to pull my hand out of the flame, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will have the urge to pull out of the flame, and I actually should pull. There's an ought there. I ought to pull my hand out of the flame, or I will be harmed. Right?
Well, there's rational oughts and moral oughts. There's two oughts.
We'll get there. In this sense, this is the very same process as your instinct about being burned or about being poisoned. It's just on a much larger time scale. So it's not acting so much on you. The fact that it's acting on you is a side effect. It's acting on the population of your genes, the population that shares your genes and has the same urges, right?
Mm-hmm.
If that population is in a situation where their behavior would endanger their survival and spreading, then they, through their individuals, will have the urge to pull their hand out of the fire, to start considering that thing as repulsive or wrong or evil or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And in which case they ought to do that. They really should, right?
Rational.
How you get it.
Rationally.
It's a rational ought.
There's no, it's a rational ought.
Ultimately grounded. Moral oughts are ultimately grounded in rational oughts. So,
right. Moral oughts are a subset of rational oughts, but rational oughts don't require moral oughts at all.
Exactly. And another thing about this specific example of your hand being in a fire or you being instantaneously poisoned. Yeah, most people. Yeah, I guarantee you, a lot of people are just going to react and just chase after the cure, or they will immediately take their hand out of the fire. But that's not them thinking rationally about it. And in any case, that's them just going off on instinct most of the time.
No. So my explanation is rational. My explanation is why it happens and how it happens. But from an internal perspective of a person experiencing that morality, that effect, they just have an urge. They have a revulsion or an attraction or the feeling of exaltation. It's non-cognitive entirely.
It's non-cognitive.
Yeah.
So it's not meta-ethical. It can't be meta-ethical. If non-cognitive theories can't be normative at all.
They can't exactly.
They can be prudential, but
yeah. So when a person puts their hand in the fire, they're not thinking, "I ought to take my hand out of the fire."
Absolutely.
They're thinking, "Fuck fire," and their hand is like right out of there. And it's so on your view, there are no morals. Moral statements are neither true nor false. Then they're just
from an objective perspective, yes. From the perspective of an objective observer, there are no morals. There is nothing right or wrong, and
Oh, Well, a problem with that is it doesn't really justify moral language. So, for example, take the proposition I ought not rape. Just that one. If now, on your view, it would be rape, like some kind of expression like that. But
yeah, literally.
Literally, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, because that's non-cognitive, but that's not how we typically.
This is roughly language.
But that doesn't really reflect
quasi-realism. It's quasi-realism. This is the book which
yeah.
That's right. One of his view is effectively quasi-realism. That's why it works. He can ground moral language precisely because he's a projectivist. He believes that you're. I mean, he doesn't put it in those terminologies. He's figured it out on himself. But.
What is a projectivist?
What?
What's a projectivist? I didn't get that part.
It's another word for a quasi-realist. It means that we speak of things as we are. Again, I actually haven't finished reading this, just so you know. But like, actually, I barely even started. I'm still in the first.
I know Blackman's a quasi-realist. I've heard that.
The quasi-realist is Max understands this stuff better than I do.
Sorry. I'll just first go through my explanation on moral language, and then I'll get to quasi-realism. So just to get back, the problem with non-cognitive theories, usually as they were understood, was if they're just expressions like rape, like something like that, then it doesn't really reflect how we use moral language. So, for example, it's true. So people like to say, I ought not rape. If I ought not rape, then I ought not rape my sister. I ought not rape, therefore I ought not rape my sister. That requires true-false predicates, because if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. That's how we use it. You don't have to accept the fact that it's sound, just that it's valid. And it is valid. If P, Q, if I ought not rape, then I ought not rape my sister. I ought not rape, then I ought not rape my sister. But on a non-cognitivist viewpoint, that makes no sense. How it wouldn't be valid. And this is where quasi-realists come in. They like to think that positive projections onto the world.
It's not that it would be invalid; it would be meaningless.
Right, it would be meaningless. Yeah. But quasi-realists want to say, no, our moral expressions are meaningful. They just don't really go with true false predicates. They invent their own kind of moral logic. So consider rape and compare it to yay charity. Yay is analogical to true, whereas is analogical to false. So under that, it could be rape my sister, rape, therefore something along those lines.
Okay.
Like Blackburn tries to make a whole logical system out of this, and states that our expressions can be a source of validity. It's just not the same, but analogical to true false. And
no, I disagree with that completely.
Yeah,
I mean, if you just pinpoint your point and the metaethical critique of non-cognitivism generally, if you just look at the antecedent and the consequent, they're meaningless. So if you look at any truth table at all, you got, like for conditionals, the only way a conditional is false is if the consequence false.
That depends on what you mean by meaningless. So they're cognitively meaningless. But that just means that you're not using true or false. Like in the philosophical language, all that means is that you're not putting truth tables. But the quasi-realist can use a truth table. They're just saying that they're saying that truth is ambiguous, that the truth can mean more than one thing. One of which, like there's an analogy here. One of which is, that's a possible meaning of false, and true is yay. That's one possible meaning.
I completely disagree with that. I don't understand how he gets there. How could be true or false?
No, it's analogical. It's just there are two opposites.
I don't see any relevant similarity between the analogy at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just not convinced. I'm not convinced. I could be wrong.
So, I'm not convinced either. Usually, I'm a little. I'm not convinced either. And Frank, maybe you could convince us.
Oh, I'm not convinced, but because I'm not. The reason I'm not convinced is completely different from you guys. I think there's epistemological issues. That's why I'm not convinced. I'm fine with it, because especially Barney's take on it, because you can, again, it's you can, I don't know, it's are you think of rational egoism. That's purely, you can have a complete morality which is purely prudential. Now think of a Kantian moral argument that can ground morality in rational egoism. It can ground, you ought to do this, you ought to do what you ought to do, because if you don't, you go to hell.
There's at least one normative proposition grounding the whole prudential schema, though, right? One ought to act in such a way that the prudential schema increases your, I don't know, reproductive fitness or whatever, right?
So for him, so again, this is why he says that there's
purely non-cognitive.
So prudentially speaking, like, it's just whatever you want, right? You have an end and you want to meet it, and these
right. But metaethically, you have to ask: ought I adopt that particular prudential moral point of view? And after I adopt it, then everything else follows. So that's still normative ethics. That sounds good to me. On a metaethical level, it's not non-cognitive, so I'm good with that. It's not just purely descriptive ethics.
Yeah, like I think ultimately descriptive ethics holds within it, just as prudential holds within it a norm, whatever it's called.
Descriptive ethics holds for any ethical system. It just describes. That's all it is.
So there's descriptive ethics in the sense that you're just talking. You're just like scientifically documenting the norms of various people.
Yeah.
That's not quite what Barney is doing, because he's saying that there is an ultimately. He's making a prediction, right? Well, he's not even making a prediction. He's saying that he's saying.
I can't see how that's not further description, though. How is that not further description by doing prediction?
Because he's not.
There is an ultimate outcome.
Correct.
At any point.
I'm not denying an ultimate outcome at all. Yeah. I see myself in your glasses.
Yeah, that will.
I see myself in your glasses.
That will justify.
Correct. Yeah.
The instinct that it's good.
Yeah. Descriptively, there's a description that you can do, which would specify what these ultimate outcomes are in relation to our acts.
Yeah.
Like what I'm saying is that
fitness, but that's not normative ethics, though. That's just purely descriptive ethics.
Okay. What's normative ethics?
That's objective ethics. Yeah, you have one principle. Yeah, you have one principle, but it's a normative ought, and there's an ant.
Is it
and then
is it merely objective, or is it universal? Does that
it's universality means that everybody goes by it. So that's not necessarily universal.
It's not
absolutely
everybody goes by it, but that it applies to everybody equally, right?
As far as I remember, universality just means everybody goes by it. But absolute would mean not trumpable.
Universal norms is something that everyone ought to do. It's as opposed to like particularist or context dependent norms.
If everyone ought to do it, I would say that's subjective, because that would be mind independent. Here,
wait, what?
I got this thing right here. So this is Louis Poyman, Discovering Ethics. So he says universalizability, or I'm sorry, universal. Let me look it up real quick, because these are key distinctions. Key distinctions. Here we go. If it's universal, it applies to all people who are in a relevantly similar situation. If one judges an act X is right for a certain person P, then it is right for everyone relevantly similar to P. This trait is exemplified in the Golden Rule. We also see it in the formal principle of justice. It cannot be right for A to treat B in a manner in which it would be wrong for B to treat A, merely on the ground that they are two different individuals. It applies to all evaluative judgments. If I say that X is a good Y, then I am logically committed to judge that anything relevantly similar to X is a good Y. This trait is an extension of the principle of consistency. One ought to be consistent about one's moral judgments, including one's moral judgments. And then objectivity has to do with prescriptivity. And this is it's action guiding. It's the nature of morality. Moral principles are generally put forth as commands or imperatives. They're intended for use to advise people and influence action. Prescriptivity shares this trait with all normative discourse and is used to appraise behavior, assign praise and blame, and produce feelings of satisfaction or guilt independent of minds. Then they have practicality, publicity, and overridingness. Overridingness is important too, but I don't think you would deny that because of this overriding principle that you have, that you ought to prudentially maximize your reproductive fitness, taking into account
not necessarily not necessarily your genes.
So again, he's saying what is the good, right? For him, the good is just the self. He's better explaining it than I am, but it has something to do with self.
Yeah,
it's not that morality defines action, which defines consequence. It's action defines consequence, which defines morality.
Action defines consequence, so it's consequential.
Well, yeah, he's
in some sense, yes. It's consequential, but not, what's the word?
So all you got to do to make it a normative theory is to make it such that we ought to actively propagate that consequentialist goal or whatever it is.
So
yeah, but you don't know you don't know what that goal is. The goal is,
well, it's just epistemological.
The goal is the thing. Yeah, exactly. You cannot.
Well, we're talking about moral ontology, right?
You're treating these things as like they're way more distinct than they are. You can't completely separate ontology with epistemology. They're always interlinked. And like
why is that? I disagree with that. Why is that?
Well, what are you so well, one, you can't know a thing without it being there, and two, you can't know a thing without you being, and then knowledge. So knowledge has being, and being is knowable. In that sense.
I think,
I don't think there's any necessary connection between. I don't think your epistemology should determine your metaphysics. Sometimes, but not all the time. Oh, there's Simos.
Well, I mean, like your epistemology puts restraints on your metaphysics, because if you have a metaphysics which you can't know anything about, then you don't know that your metaphysics is true.
I think Edward Fraser has a quick way of summing it up. On epistemology presupposes ontology, because when you're speaking about knowledge, it's always knowledge about something.
Oh, sure, but I'd still be willing to admit that there might be something out there I don't know yet.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying.
It's not constrained in that sense.
Yeah, that's not what I meant. But
so how does that apply to what Barney said?
So he's the reason that I'm as I see it, Barney is concerned, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. He's concerned with first what people will do before what they ought to do, and he gets what people ought to do from what they will do. There is this not merely prudential, but like purely descriptive. But
yeah, it's not normative then.
Yeah. Yes and no. So there's a certain way of there's a sense in which there's a historical sort of diachronic way of viewing description. But then there is just like the listing out of the categories, like what exists. Well, you could say that a good sort of thing is that which fully meets its essence or something like this. So like a good human is somebody who fully, if you're a Christian, you can take a Christian exemplar theory. A good Christ is an example of a perfect human, which means that there's such a thing as an imperfect human, which means that you're less human than you could be.
Well, do you agree with the distinction between moral and non-moral goods? So you're saying you define the good in a certain way. What I'm going to do is say it's a non-moral good, and so there's no normativity, and it's non-cognitive, and it's purely descriptive.
Well, if
I'm still not clear on the concept of normativity. What does that mean?
Oughtness, just oughtness.
Yeah,
there's moral oughtness and rational oughtness.
Okay, so the meta-ethical setup, from my understanding, meta-ethical setup of this is purely descriptive. It doesn't tell you what you ought to do.
Then it's not meta-ethics.
What? No. Okay, it's a description of ethics. It's an explanation how ethics come about.
Yeah,
how they are
descriptive
formed.
ethics.
So I thought that's what meta-ethics is.
Well,
now, the ethics of it are normative. Why? Because you are compelled to do what you feel you should do, including conform to your society by the circumstances that you have come to be in. You individually, as a part of your society, as a part of your environment, and as a consequence of the history that brought you about, you have an ought, you have an urge that you must respect and have to respect, and so your morality is normative to you within that context.
That's a jump. It's a jump to go from a mere description of the compulsion to the normativity of following the compulsion. You gotta build that bridge there.
Well, actually, this is where so you're right.
Could I give a suggestion of how? Oh, sorry, Frank. I was going to suggest.
My wife's calling me. Dang it! I'm going to lose the course of the conversation. I apologize. I'll be right back.
Sorry, Frank. You were going to suggest the way to bridge that, because I also thought of a way you might be able to.
So the only way to bridge it. So the way you can bridge that leads into my epistemological problem. But so the point is, well, you said what you were going to say. I'm not going to.
So there's this. So if you want, there's this really good epistemologist by the name of Michael Huemer. He has an epistemology. Michael Huemer.
Huemer. Okay.
Yeah. Humer, I believe. In any case, it's called conservative phenomenology. So this is how his theory of knowledge works. He's a foundationalist of sorts and an internalist. That means he believes that knowledge is internal to one's mind. It's not found external because of an external set of circumstances. He believes that when it comes to the world, we all see, and when it comes to our beliefs, they all seem like they're true. So, for example, let's say it seems that I'm sitting right here talking to a bunch of people on Google Plus, and one of them is named Simon, who, by the way, hi, Simon.
Hello! It is the baby Jesus.
And, all right, so this is what it seems like, and I really don't have any reason to believe why this is not actually the case. Like, I'm not high or drunk. It doesn't feel like I'm drinking.
Phenomenal conservatism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it seems, so I have no defeaters. So if something seems the case and you have no reason to doubt it, no good reason, then prima facie, or on the face of it, you should accept it until such a time where you actually have a defeater for it. Now, of course, all that we could believe could be false, but yeah, it's a form of, but that's the kind of skepticism we all have to deal with anyway. But until such a time, you are entitled to say what you believe is true. So if you're saying we have this kind of internal compulsion, and this internal compulsion says we ought to do something, then yeah, it does seem like it. Why not just trust that impulse? I think maybe that would be a good way to defend it if one's inclined to that sort of epistemology. I'm not, but
I think MJ's issue is more, how do you go from descriptive to normative? But just because there are these normative structures that arise naturally or whatever, doesn't mean that you in fact ought to follow them.
What does it mean? What does it mean? In fact, ought to.
So there you go.
Oh, ought. So ought just mean, so they're descriptive claims like, for example, John is giving to charity. That's just a matter of fact. but then again, one could say John ought to give to charity, or John giving to charity is morally right. The first one is normative. That means that not only is he doing it, but that's what he ought to be doing. That's what he's duty bound to do.
Yes, and I would say that my descriptivist view about all of us explains why John as an individual ought to do it.
Why John ought to do it, or why he feels like he ought to do it?
So, no, like his view explains both. So this is how I would view it, and he's not. I don't think Barney. I don't actually think you're going to agree with this way of wording. Well, you might. Yeah. So the way I approach morality more generally, and this is why I actually, this is how I'm interpreting. If there's a fact of the matter as to whether you ought to do something, all that means it means one of two things. Well, in Barney's view, it would mean one of two things. One, there is in fact a system of rules in place, descriptively speaking, and you're in it. And two, that's the system which either is going to win or it's going to be sufficiently similar to the one that ultimately wins. That ultimately survives out, right? That's how Barney works out. Like for me, it's like subjective ought is that there is such a system, considered independently of whether or not it's going to win, but whether or not it's the right system. And then so all the fact of the matter is that there is in fact a system of rules. There is this social construct that there's a game in place, and one of the rules of the game is you ought to do this, and you're failing to play the game, as it were. But different games, the games themselves, are not all good games to play, and some of them are going to lead to you dying. So there's this, and that's purely like that's the prudential approach. This is game theoretic, right? Like there's the actual game that you're playing, and some of them are going to, no matter if you iterate them over and over again, you die. But I don't think MJ would like that, because I think MJ wants to ground moral facts in something other than merely the presence of a system, the presence of a game, as it were, a moral game. And again, Barney does do it more than that. He includes that second condition that I noted. The game has to either be the one that ultimately wins out, that the stable eternal society.
It has to be the one that is winning out, not winning out, that is successful at a given point in time, right?
Oh yeah, but you can relativize it. So you can say, okay, there is local goodness and then there's global goodness. Local goodness is at this point in time. Global goodness, if it exists, you can be agnostic as to whether or not global goodness exists, but your system allows that category, and you could say, well, maybe there is some stable state of human culture, the utopia, or that's not a good not a good word, but like there is some stable state of moral systems which, once humans get into that moral system, the society structure put together and the technology and whatnot, it won't die, and it will move on perpetually, at least, and that would be the moral system. And you can say somebody is right relative to different systems. So there's local rightness, and then there's global rightness, and true rightness would be the global rightness. But like, and this is the
but in this system, that concept of rightness would be tied into the circumstances, environment, right? So if the circumstances change, if the environment changes, then that morality either has to be adaptable to all circumstances and all environments, that ultimate winning out, right? Or it will as well have to change and proceed evolving as the system evolves, as the environment.
Yeah, but like so it's sort of the thing about that is mathematically, like, well, I can't imagine. If you have a function that changes itself, so you're having this system and it changing itself over time, so you think the game changes over time. Logically, though, if there is a function which if you have a self-changing function, if you have a computer program which manipulates its own program, technically speaking, you can model that singular program, even though you could think of it as a program which is changing over time, you could also think of a larger program which describes that singular program changing over time, which the larger program is just one steady state. And so it doesn't matter. So there actually is going to be a finite system of rules. It's just like a meta rule, right? There's a meta system of rules in which these tiny systems of rules follow within. And
that doesn't sound so reasonable to me. It depends on how the system's changing and whether it's changing based upon a parameter that already exists within itself, or whether any information is being added. If the function has new information being added, then it might not be self-referential.
Well, yeah, like consider the system is like the whole universe. Like there's no, it's a closed system.
Sure, that's an assumption. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's roughly how
we're dealing with assumptions.
Includes his entire worldview, right? So it's a given in this context of the conversation.
Okay. I'm just questioning for the sake of it, you know.
No, it's a good question. It's help clarify stuff. So, because of that, Barney, there would be well, not necessarily. So you could have. So you're not like, you can't say that there's definitely going to be a utopia and the world is evolving to that in some sort of what's his name? He comes after Kant in
Hegel.
Yeah, some sort of Hegelian ideal, right? For all you know, the world could fall apart, right? Like, so you don't know if there actually is the system of rules. If the actual future is the one where, you know, humanity kills itself and there actually was no right way of doing it. Like, so the whole system itself could be that there is no perpetual state, and so there is no right morality, for all you know, right? Like,
and the local state,
but that's okay because you have the local, like that. Your local thing makes you say, okay, but like in that case, you're a subjectivist. In that case, you don't have an objective ethic. The only way I see your view having an objective ethic is given that you have this global system, which is why I say you need God to exist.
But doesn't this also assume that, or like it already assumes that you ought to go for the you know, your end ought to be that society thrives or that there's this utopia?
No. It doesn't. The thing is that you can have a morality which will destroy you, but in that case, that morality will destroy you, and you will be out of the game.
Right, but not immediately.
You have to. So you're not entirely. So this is where
the morality comes after the fact. The urge to call something good or bad, the cognition of morality comes after it has been successful, after it has been, or does it? It is intermixed with the creation of that morality, of that strategy of playing. If we're using the analogy of the game.
So are you talking about like morality being some kind of result of evolution?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't. So like, it's possible that we have, you know, this idea of morality, like we ought not to, say, kill our siblings, right? Because that'll have a negative effect on an evolutionary scale. But that doesn't tell us what we ought to do, right?
What he's saying is that your local your local culture more or less tells you what to. Well, actually, what he's really saying is that your own choice tells you what to do. your conscience, roughly, and like so. Like, this is where I say his epistemology is. He has epistemology.
Yes, but not cognitively, not rationally, not by your choice. You do not define your morality, right?
Yeah, like you don't get to choose how your conscience tells you what to do.
You are compelled to have a morality. One component of that morality, very likely if you're a social animal, is to conform to the society that you're in, which is why we have the concepts and understanding of morality as oughts, as the language of describing morality that we have, because in a social context, we need to be able to communicate with each other what will be acceptable by the society. Because the thing that kind of is important to you is will you be supported if you just follow your instinct? And you will then have an instinct to do that if it's beneficial. So I might have an urge to I don't know, again, to rape, right? And I have an instinct that I want to rape, that I just want to go around and start impregnating women. But I also have an instinct to check with my society, to check with my community, what will their reactions to that be? And if their reactions to that be is that they're going to kill me with clubs if I rape somebody, then I will also have an instinct to say, okay, I'm going to suppress that first instinct because that's going to kill me. That's going to harm my progression, right?
So what? This might seem out of nowhere. What is your view of free will, Dilly? I think we talked about this before, but I can't remember.
Go ahead. What is my view
on free will? Because
I'm a determinist.
Okay, so the phenomenology you're describing is it's like, we have these two competing urges, and there's an argument that, well, why does one urge come out rather than the other? And you could say that the strongest competing urge wins, and that's what
So again, it works out in the same way. You could have one urge succeeding or the other urge succeeding.
Yeah, the question is why in any given instance, why do you choose one urge over the other? Is choice simply the consequence of the competition of urges?
So because you have to choose one or the other. You cannot choose both nor neither.
Yeah.
Okay. So
that's a condition though. So
now let's just play out through both scenarios, right? If one urge is stronger than the other, if the urge to rape is stronger than the urge to conform in that society that I have described, then I will rape, and I will be beaten with clubs and killed, and therefore the chemical setup which created that urge will not be propagated.
So this is where so the question here is, so I'm going to need to make a distinction that we talked about a while ago, but we didn't go into it deeply. I need to figure out what you mean by urge, because by urge you could be speaking existentially or intentionally. You could be speaking phenomenologically. You could be speaking about the feeling or you could be speaking about just the chemical process going on in your brain.
I'm saying that those two things are very intricately linked.
I'm not denying that, right? But it's important to determine what you're talking about, because if you say phenomenally, right, the feeling is so let's say, suppose you're saying that the reason you choose what you choose is because these chemical processes work out such that the phenomenal the first person analog of the strongest urge wins, because the chemical process, the similar chemical processes win. This is really analogous. In that case, yeah, that's fine with determinism. But phenomenologically speaking, I can have one urge which is way stronger than another. I can really want to punch somebody in the face, but I can have no desire whatsoever to restrain myself, and yet I restrain myself on principle. I don't have the feeling to restrain myself. There's no first person subjective sense of the urge to not punch somebody in the face. But from a
determinist point of view, that's kind of nonsensical.
No, it's not, right? So you could say that the reason I don't choose is because there is some other underlying chemical process. It just so happens that chemical process doesn't produce the feeling of an urge, right? This is why I'm making there's a distinction between.
Urge is an example of the correct word is compulsion, right?
Yeah, but again, phenomenologically, it's like compulsion is that you're either describing this is the outworking of a deterministic process, and so what happens will happen, or there's this feeling you have first person, which itself may or may not be the result of such a deterministic process. But the point is that I don't have any particular, when I restrain myself on a purely phenomenological level, from acting on anger. I only have one urge, and it's the anger, and restraining it is difficult. Right? It requires effort.
So,
but I restrain.
When you say I restrain my urge, that restrainment is an urge in itself. You have a principle, and you have the urge to follow that principle, which overpowers your urge to right?
I think there's an ambiguity in the way you're using the word urge or compulsion.
That's why I said compulsion.
No, I think it's just as ambiguous because, again, like it's hard to determine whether or not you're speaking of the there's a specific form of determinism which I have no problem with, and what?
Compatibilism?
Well, no, it's
where are we at?
Welcome back, guys.
Yeah, we're just at the point where we've decided that philosophers that talk about morals seem to be implying that flogging a dead horse is a good thing. Sorry, I had to joke.
I can't say that stuff when I'm in the middle of drinking. What the heck?
Actually, could I just ask something about impulses being indicating an ought? Like, don't people have impulses to do morally wrong things, though, or what we would consider morally wrong? So, for example, imagine you're in a situation where you're married, but you go to a bar and this really beautiful woman hits on you and wants you to, well, you know the rest. And that, yeah.
But you wake up the next morning and it's a guy. Yeah, I know the rest.
Well, yeah. In light of that, like at that point, we all have that kind of animalistic impulse or urge to have sex with that person, or there are a good group of people who would, and yet at the same time, we would want our higher, more rational sense that thinks in the long term to prevail and say, yeah, just because you have this kind of impulse doesn't mean you ought to act on it. In fact, you should really think about these other kinds of things. And at which case you might say, well, that's just the kind of impulse on its own, but at which point, which of the impulses ought we follow? And that just brings in the question all over again.
And I would say that this system, this description, works perfectly for that, whereas any other that I've heard simply don't. Because if there is true good and true evil as a set morality, as an ought, then and if it was beneficial in some way, then the bad things would gradually disappear more and more and more and more until we remained as purely good beings with no evil urges and no compulsion to do anything wrong, right?
I don't see that.
Yeah, I don't see how that would follow there. No, in fact, on like my
wait, let me just explain the flip side of what I said, and then it might be clearer. In this system, if you sorry, just give me 1 second. Somebody's
trying to get in the room.
Somebody's trying to get in the room that I would actually like to have in the room. Though I must say this hangout thus far is just about the dream team of hangouts as I imagined them.
Wow.
Where
what a compliment.
I can fight Jack Angstrike in here, and that could be fun.
Only when Simos came in, then we became the dream team. He's like Michael Jordan.
I can imagine very few people that I would. Ozzy, maybe. Well, not maybe. I would definitely like Ozzy.
Yeah, I just.
But no, I wouldn't. I wouldn't because nobody else would get a word in. But I would still be happy.
Yeah, that's the first time I ever heard him. Last night in TST, he's awesome.
He's awesome.
He's very articulate.
Okay. So.
You know, he. I believe one of his jobs was actually giving presentations quite a bit, and he used to. Not only does he have a master's degree in philosophy, but he used to TA in it as well. So.
Oh, that's me. I got a master's, and I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Guam.
University of Guam.
That's where I'm at right now. It's 1:02 p.m.
How does it feel losing your How does it feel losing your right to vote?
Oh yeah, I don't care. I'm a fatalist with voting. Okay, Sarah.
There's there's a really good if we want to get into the field of economics for just 1 second, or I mean behavioral economics, there's a professor by the name of Brian Kaplan who has this really good book called The Myth of the Rational Voter, where he makes really succinct argument about why voting is actually a very problematic thing within society, mostly because voters are by and large uninformed about very specific issues, and
like
because
me.
of it,
I'm uninformed.
Yeah, but like there's actually rationale. So becoming informed has a cost. So economically speaking, there is a rationale. They're rationally uninformed. So it's just that we don't take that into account in our systems, and so we fail. So.
Yeah, okay, for any political issue that you pick, I will probably be able to go back and forth with you twice before I'm like, oh, I'll go read up on that.
That's basically what happens, really. That's philosophy, right? Like in a nutshell. It's like, we can get it to a certain point, and
yeah. I mean, Kaplan himself suggests there could be some kinds of steps we could take to correct it, like offer up a program where people take civics tests, and if they get a good grade, they get $100. So that kind of encourages, or some set of money, and that kind of encourages them to brush up on civics, common issues, things of the like.
Under Barney's ethics, he'd be right to take the test.
Maybe.
Maybe. But going back to Barney's ethics for a minute, I still don't think I have an answer to the question. We have multiple impulses, some of which urge us to do the opposite thing, sometimes even at the same time, like the bar example, either sexual impulses, in which case
and all of those things are in conflict. So how does that come about? So if everybody let's say if everybody cheats on everybody, and there are no familial structures or upbringing structures, then genes don't get passed across. But if everybody's more or less working in pairs and pooling their resources, then there is a huge advantage if you can just slip one in. If you can be the odd person that manages to impregnate somebody else's wife, or manages to get another woman pregnant and get away with it, then you have doubled your genes.
Oh no.
Right? In other words, the evil is parasitic upon the good.
The evil is literally parasitic upon the good. And it will cause the behavior that we actually see. And
the evil people. This is why I like his view. It's if you look at it, it works. It's so very beautiful because it mixes with scholastic views. His view implies, one, the evil is parasitic on the good, and two, people do evil things
how is
because
that?
they confuse it for a better good.
How does his view imply that the evil is parasitic on the good? I thought it implied the opposite.
So again, he can say that there's goods relative to individuals and goods relative to the group, good relative to the whole species.
I do too. I believe that too.
And so what he finds is that so there's prudential good, right? You want to meet your end and whatever.
Which is a non-moral good.
But the
prudential good is non-moral.
But the moral good is ultimately the ultimate good, right? The global whatever thing that I was talking about, that would be the moral good, really. If it exists, right? It's
not grounded in descriptions, right?
What?
Didn't he want the description to come first? That's where the global good comes from. I'm talking like Barney's not even here. Sorry, is that what you're saying?
So, like,
I don't understand the question.
He approaches things descriptively, and from there he gets. So it's like he gets his ethics through his physics, and biology.
I don't see that at all. That's the value problem. That's the is-ought problem. I don't see how you go from an is to an ought at all. I don't see that.
I don't either.
I don't. I see it, but I
see how you
don't.
can go, I can see how you go from is to prudential oughts or rational oughts, but not moral normative oughts.
Yes, but precisely because moral normative oughts are a subset of rational oughts.
That's the assertion.
What?
Yeah, I disagree.
You said earlier that you agree that.
You can
right, but
you can
I don't
rationally
think that just because you have rational oughts, you have more oughts.
You don't need that rationality to be moral. Right?
I agree with that too.
If I could just comment on the proposed solution, though, what I understand is, look, when you take both of these impulses, what you're supposed to do to determine the better one is which one provides better satisfaction in the long run, as opposed to the one which leads to less satisfaction in the long run. In which case, it seems like the good is long-term satisfaction. In which case, it doesn't seem to me like it's the impulse itself which is the good, but rather it's something a little more fundamental, which is human satisfaction. And which case,
the good is redefined in non-moral terms. Satisfaction, that's a non-moral state. So if you just redefine the good, this is what Sam Harris does with well-being. You redefine the good in non-moral terms, and then you just let the rest of the system play out. But it's not normative at root.
I'm not. So I'm, again, from a completely objective outside perspective, I'm claiming that there is no morality.
Correct.
There is no such a thing as a morality. There is no such a thing as the goal of that morality, or right? But for you internally, and for me internally, there is a goal, there is a morality, there is an ought, there is, right?
Well, another problem.
It's deflated.
Just to touch on the whole long-term satisfaction thing, forget the objectivity of morality for a minute. If it's long-term satisfaction, doesn't that mean things like self-sacrifice would be wrong? Because there is no long-term satisfaction to be had. I remember hearing of one story I remember hearing one story of a criminal who who had inclinations to go back. He saved a guard from dying, freezing in the ice, and upon doing that, he was captured, and he was sent back to prison, and he died. In the long term, in terms of long-term satisfaction, he should not have done that. But we clearly have moral intuitions that say no, self-sacrifice, especially if you're a criminal trying to do the right thing, is good.
That's supererogatory.
If there's a God, then that wouldn't be the case.
Oh, I know, but I'm just critiquing his.
From Barney's point of view, yeah.
Yeah, he's talking about oughts, and you don't have to perform supererogatory acts, though, right, Max?
Right. But
well, I was just asking. Sorry.
I think there are some cases where you do. Martyrship is one example.
Well, by definition, it wouldn't be supererogatory. I thought it's going beyond the call of duty. Supererogatory.
Oh, all right. I see. I thought you meant arbitrary.
No. Sorry. Supererogatory.
Oh, right.
What's the word? Arbitrary?
Supererogatory.
Agratory.
It's a good thing to do, but you don't have to do it. Like throwing yourself on a grenade to save your soldiers or something like that. It's morally praiseworthy, but you don't have to do it. That's why it's awesome.
Yeah. Oh, it's altruistic, in a sense.
The thing that'll make you a hero. You don't have to be a hero, but right?
or being generous, like when charitable, like when you're on the street and you see a beggar. You don't have to give him $5 in your pocket. Or even if, let's say you only have $100 bill, you don't have to give it, but it would be super nice if you did.
That's what Peter Singer does wrong. I think he collapses supererogatory rights into moral oughts. Thinks you're being immoral if you don't give a certain subset of your income to the suffering. But
so one part of it again is that morality is not yours alone. It's not that you are the only relevant being in that universe. Every being that shares your genes, like your genes get spread as long as anything that has your genes procreates. right?
And
You don't have to have
propagation of
children
species is
to
non-moral.
have your genes spread. So if you help your brother, if you help your cousin, you're in helping them, in sacrificing yourself to help them, you are spreading some of your genes. If you can help a lot of people at the same time by sacrificing yourself, you might be spreading a large portion of your genes to a huge population. Right?
What do you mean by your? What do you mean by your genes, though?
Genes that are identical to your genes.
Oh, but the only genes that are identical to my genes are my own genes.
No.
Or are you speaking about resemblances? Genes that bear greater resemblance towards yours.
Genes that perform the identical function and cause the identical chemical setup, right? Cause the same urge.
He's talking about partial identity. So it's not like the whole your exact copy of the genes. It's just that like
one gene. So let's say you have one gene that creates the chemical, the hormone which creates in you the urge for sex, the urge to reproduce, right? And you also have another gene which causes in you the chemical setup in your brain that creates a revulsion from rape, right? You can have one, you can have the other, you can have, so you have the setup of those genes. Each of those genes will be prevalent in the population as much as it contributes to the individuals that have it, to
Quick
the
question.
reproduction of the. Go ahead.
I have an intuition that I need you to kind of deal with for me.
Okay.
If somebody goes through their whole life without propagating a single gene, are they immoral?
If somebody goes through their whole life propagating a single gene
Without propagating a single gene, can they still live a moral life?
they can.
If they don't have
yes,
children.
Because they have family members, and if they protect their family members have the same genes as they do, so they can preserve them.
You can adjust it. You can adjust it any way you want, though. So let's say
Also, they might understand that their genes aren't or have sufficient defect, right? So they might be acting altruistically.
So let's
in order
pretend,
by not passing the genes on.
because theories, ethical theories, or even descriptive theories that are striving to be normative, I would say have to be necessarily true across all possible worlds. So if I can think of a possible world in which somebody has a gene.
Why is that the case?
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy that.
I don't buy that.
I think you're saying morals are objective, and I've yet to hear a convincing argument for.
Well, if whatever you have to say with regard to an ethical theory, it's you could list it out as an individually necessary and sufficient conditions to satisfy the theory, right? If they're individually necessary and jointly sufficient, they have to be applied across all possible worlds, right?
No.
Why is that? I don't follow that.
Because from an objective perspective, there is no morality.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, I'm just saying it would have to apply necessarily across all possible worlds, whether it be moral or not. It just has to be, if you have these conditions that say, look, this is the way to be moral, and it's grounded in descriptive ethics, you're going to have a set of individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions that would qualify to satisfy your theory.
I'm not following you at all.
But I think we can. There's an if at the beginning, so we can move on. But if that is the case, that morals are objective, then yes.
Oh, I think the confusion here might be that
there would be a condition there.
No. Like, your emphasis on the descriptive ethics, I may have caused a confusion a while back. When I say that he's entering things through like descriptively, I say he's getting his morality from his physics and whatnot. I don't mean that like he's describing the things and then leaving it off there. It's.
No, I agree. I agree. He's keeping them in. I just think it's being redefined in non-moral terms if it's based on the physics.
Well, move on and make your point, MJ, because you said if, and
that's the whole point.
I know it's the whole point, but let's just get to the end of the second part.
So my point is, if we were to list out a set of conditions that would need to be satisfied in order for it to qualify as Barney ethics, let's call it Barney ethics.
Mm-hmm.
This listing of the conditions would have to be individually necessary and jointly sufficient in order for it to qualify as Barney ethics. But if they're individually necessary and jointly sufficient to qualify as Barney ethics, necessary, that part, that modal term, that implies it has to be true in all possible worlds.
Well, for everybody. I mean, let's just say for everybody, because we're talking about morals, right?
Well, right. I think that everybody in all possible worlds, I would say, because that would be implied by the very terminology of individually sufficient,
well,
or
given
individually
the first,
necessary, jointly sufficient.
Sure, given the first premise, that would follow, yeah.
If I think of a possible world where I have a gene, I have genes that aren't defunct, and he doesn't propagate any of them, right. Could he still live a moral life in that world where we don't really adjust things, where in this world it wouldn't work out, in this world you get caught if you try to rape anybody? But if I can think of a world where
you're trying to rephrase the question, is not passing your genes on moral?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a counterexample in the same way that Gettier counterexamples work with JTB.
Well, again, if the genes are not worthy to be passed on, say you have a gene where 90% of your family die from cancer, before they're 25.
Let's say that's not the case.
You may wish to consider not passing your genes on, right?
Correct.
And that seems to be a moral thing to do for humanity, but not necessarily for your line of genes.
Correct. But let's say in this world, this guy has perfect genes, but he just chose not to propagate any of them. And so my question is, could he still live a moral life if he had perfect genes and decided not to propagate any of them in this world?
Let's say he is the only one who has these genes, and if he perishes, those genes will perish with him, and that urge not to propagate his genes will also perish with him. Then he will just disappear, and that moral impulse that he had would no longer be present as a possibility.
I get that. He'd perish. I get all that. But would he still live a moral life before he perished?
Okay. Actually, I think the question is
moral relative to who? Moral relative to what? Right?
To Barney ethics.
You're implying that that humanity itself has an objective standard of morals to which this person should apply themselves, right? If this man has the genes which say lead to telepathy or something like that, right? And he's the only one in the whole of humanity that's ever going to get these genes, and he decides not to pass on the gene for telepathy, right? Then clearly that's immoral in terms of if we think that society, that humanity itself has a goal.
That's completely
and that's the assumption that you're making, that there is an objective goal for humanity.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem to be a representative of what we actually see anyway.
So let's say under this system I have the genes which urge me not to propagate those genes.
Okay.
If I obey them, I am doing the morally correct thing by my moral, by my actual moral norms, right?
So your universal principle then, your principle would be not necessarily to propagate your genes, but to obey your strongest urge. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, that would be a non-normative, descriptive principle.
Why?
Because it's grounded in physics, right? It's grounded in.
What do you mean by
physics.
normative?
I've asked him that.
Yeah, ought. There's rational oughts and moral oughts.
Yeah, I don't know why you necessarily make a distinction there.
It's everywhere in ethical philosophy. It's a fundamental distinction that ethical philosophers make.
You're turning around the you cannot get an ought from an is. I just got an ought from an is, and you're saying, well, because you got it from an is, therefore it's not an ought.
Well, you redefine the ought, though. It's an individual ought, right?
Yeah, and I asked you, can you define the ought for me? If it's what you should do and it's what you're, that's an ought. That what I've been talking about all this time are oughts.
Normativity has these things called. Here's the properties of normativity: prescriptivity, universalizability, overridingness, publicity, and practicability. So this first one, prescriptivity. Now, these are necessary, individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for something to qualify as a normative moral ought. If you just relativize the ought to the person, you can analyze that in non-cognitive terms and totally get the normativity out of it. That's the main thing. So, but if you keep prescriptivity and universalizability, that's going to be incompatible with the ises that you set up at the beginning.
Okay, so in that case,
So you could have those individual laws.
in that case, what I'm saying is that understanding of morality that you have just given is just completely flat out wrong, and
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
It's an outcome of the same process. You would be compelled to see morality in that way simply due to the circumstances of our species and the need to communicate morality so that we can coordinate, so that we can anticipate outcomes. And
that's purely that's so in the literature you get this distinction between prescriptive ethics and descriptive ethics. That's purely descriptive ethics, what you just gave me.
Yes, that's purely, fair enough.
Descriptive ethics, yeah. So without prescriptive ethics, those little individual oughts or group relative oughts are going to be relative to the descriptions. And if you're just confined to descriptions, prescriptivity is gone, universalizability is gone, which is fine. That's non-cognitivism.
Yes.
It's a non-cognitive theory. That's it. Yeah, Barney ethics is non-cognitivism.
You're applying you're telling me what the label is. That label means nothing to me. From what
I'll define it.
Not cognitivism means you cannot think about it.
Non-cognitivism means this. It means if you have prescriptive, normative, moral oughts, those are meaningless. That's what non-cognitivism is.
Do you want to just tell me what prescriptive means in that sentence?
A prescriptive just means here. This is Louis Poyman. This is a regular textbook on ethics. So I'll read it real quick because he'll say it better than me. It's action guiding, and it's the nature of morality, where descriptive ethics isn't really morality. It's just you're describing whatever's happening in the world. And then he says, they're usually commands or imperatives. They're intended for use to advise people and influence action. Prescriptivity shares this trait with all normative discourse and is used to appraise behavior, assign praise and blame, and produce feelings of satisfaction or guilt, where such injunctions are mind independent. And so as long as you get out of prescriptive ethics,
that seems to be a problem. Saying that morals are mind independent.
That's the thing that's the thing that I said at the beginning and stick to it. From the perspective of an objective observer, morality doesn't exist. There is no ought which is independent from what you are, what the history of you coming to being is, right? There is no ought.
There's just descriptive oughts.
Descriptive oughts. There is an ought for you as a person.
Descriptively.
I can
not normatively.
I can describe how or why you have it. I cannot tell you what it is. Only you know what it is.
And by nature, it wouldn't be normative. It would just be descriptive.
So the question. When you say something isn't normative, it's as though you're saying it has no power over you, or you are not really obliged to do it. The question is, what is it like? So what more could the power be but these phenomenal first person, the feeling that you ought to do something, or else a line of reasoning that you've concluded? But if
this is metaethics. This is metaethics. So this gets into the metaphysics of ethics.
If it's just a feeling, then quasi realism wins. Right? If it and quasi realism can answer the logical part too, in which case he's fine. Like it is normal.
I don't think he can answer it though.
Just to bring up something, I think that from an objective observer viewpoint, I think a good case can be made for objective ethics. I mean, I think it's a little. An objective form of morality is the major view by most philosophers in the field of ethics. majority of them hold that view, and I think it would be kind of imprudential to just declare it an impossibility. So there's that, but without appealing too much to authority here, maybe using the distinction between a rational ought and a moral ought, we could actually say that there is justification for moral oughts. So here's a rational ought for you. Take something fundamental in classical logic, such as
Modus ponens.
Modus ponens, yes. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Now, but why is that deduction valid? So let's say we have an argument such as that all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Okay, I'll accept those two premises, but why does the why does the conclusion follow from those two premises? Someone could respond by saying, oh, well, here's why. If it was the case that, imagine for a minute that you believe all men are mortal, and you believe Socrates is a man, well, if he's part of that huge circle of all men, then therefore you have to believe that he's moral. But again, it seems to me that in order to defend deduction, the person is just using more deduction, in which case that argument seems circular.
Have you heard have you heard the distinction though between rule circularity and premise circularity?
I have
rule circularity is easily forgiven. You can do rule circularity virtuously, but premise circularity is what's horrible. That should be avoided.
I see. I mean,
it helped me out.
Oh,
does this have anything to do with Roy Sorensen's self-exemplifying circular arguments?
No,
I actually got that from the SCP article on abduction.
Oh, I see. And the only reason I was bringing that up I suppose I could just ask something along the lines of why is rule circularity okay, but why isn't premise circularity okay? In which case, I believe you'd give me some kind of rational explanation or some kind of deduction. In which case, it still seems to me like you're just using more philosophical deductions to justify something. Now, the reason I bring this up is, so one could just say, look, deduction is just so morally intuitive that even if this argument that no matter how persuasive this argument seemed to be on paper, intuition just says that, no, this is just a fundamental rule of the universe. It's not something that has to be inferred by other rules. It's just something we have a natural intuition to see. And this is, a kind of intuitive epistemology defended by rationalists as opposed to empiricists. So if we believe that about our rational intuitions, how about why is it not the case that we can believe that about our moral intuitions? Our moral intuitions on quite a few things seem very strong. Like no matter how much someone tells me that morality is subjective, I believe if I propose that we skin a baby alive and use its skin to make lampshades, I think I don't think I could find a single human being, and I hope I couldn't, who would say, "Yeah, that strikes me as a good idea."
It's like Matt Slick has entered the room.
I know Matt's. I know like these seem very blunt and
no,
broad.
It's an intuition pump. It's an intuition pump.
Yeah, it's an intuition pump. I'll fully admit that. But I think when our intuitions scream that loudly about something, or like how they can with deduction, I think we're at a point where we can say, yeah, you know what, this very deep intuitive thing, even if we're allowing it to be overturned by something else in the future, I think at the very least we should give it, on the face of it, some kind of justification and wait for a defeater, at the very least.
It's like phenomenal conservatism a little bit.
It is, yeah. It's another way to think about it is just prudential. Is just giving it a prudential epistemology. A kind of epistemology where certain things are just taken as accepted, not because there's some not because that's the foundation of our ethics, but rather in prudence about a lot of our beliefs is necessary. Otherwise, we just believe. Otherwise, we can just change our opinions on a whim when we're presented with the tough arguments. Like, there are plenty of times where I've had to think about what I believe because someone presented a good argument, but I don't change my view all the time because of it. Otherwise, I'd change my views far more often than I already do.
And it's not up to you. Right?
So when talking about the, that particular logic syllogism that you argued for, I mean, the inference comes from the definition of what men are, right? I mean, that's the inference that the conclusion follows on.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the assumption in that argument,
You're
right?
joining two different classes.
So, say again, MJ?
You're joining two different classes. So all those people that are members of the class of being a man, and all those things that are members of the class of being mortal, you're joining them in a universal affirmative proposition. And then,
well, I was kind of saying that what links premise 1 to premise 2 is the fact that the members of the set of men are man.
Exactly.
Right, and that's definitional, isn't it? Presumably.
And Socrates is a man. Yep.
Right. If a member of the set is a man, then that member is also immortal. Since Socrates is part of that set, then he would be mortal. And a lot of people would say it's definitional. And that's something that's usually pointed out when it comes to all true deductions, all deductions that are just a priori, that don't have any kind of empirical inference, which I'm willing to grant. But I think the point isn't about, I don't think the point is about soundness. I think the point is about validity.
Well, that's what makes it valid, though. I mean, it makes it a valid form that there is an inference connection between the premises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, you're saying it's semantic, not synthetic. Not syntactical, not semantic.
Well, yeah, the necessary part is an assumption, even though the conclusion seems to be valid.
Right, so when it comes to saying something is syntactical, in the same way a computer might do it, it's like saying the computer, if you were to insert, a piece of paper into it with, like those old time computers, those huge
punch cards, yeah.
Right, and if it was proper, it would go green light, and if it was improper, it would go red light. That's not to say that the machine had some kind of artificial intelligence in there, but it's just saying but rather it's just confirming that the thing is obeying the rules or it's not obeying the rules. And at the base of it, it's just a bunch of rules. So that's been one kind of response to it, but there's always kind of have you ever heard of the modus moron projection?
Yes.
I haven't, no.
So modus morons is like modus ponens, except it fails. So we reductio ad absurdum. So imagine setting up a system where if P then Q, Q therefore P. So instead of affirming the consequent, which is fallacious, you actually get under modus morons, you actually do get to say it's true. So modus morons would therefore be just as syntactically valid as modus ponens. But that's kind of weird to say because then really any kind of rule is arbitrary, and one form of deduction is no more truer or valid than any other form. They're just more helpful than not. In which case, then we're not really talking about. What we're talking about is some form of pragmatism, which is more foundational to our epistemology. In which case,
but you can have a kind of rule circularity, I guess, if that's the term, in that pragmatism, so that you find that the reason the logical system is useful is because it's connected to reality in such a way that it is useful.
Exactly.
And so you can actually have a consequentialist view of logic, if that makes sense.
Well,
because the world just is such that this logical system works out, and all possible worlds must be because that's how it works out.
Well,
Unfortunately,
whatever the possible world is.
I kind of assumed that that's what is assumed by logic and philosophy, and
oh no, that's a very empirical understanding of logic, which you know.
I don't know about that.
That was actually.
Like, no.
I'm not saying that to poo-poo it. I mean, W.V.O. Quine held to that view. He thought everything was empirical, including logic, and that logic itself can be overturned on empirical evidence. Yeah, I mean, but one problem with that is it does heavily weaken it, because if you look at how empirical things work, that's justified on induction, and to justify deduction on induction seems odd because induction is generally much weaker than deduction. But for deduction, we actually
remember
Not when you're talking about
all deduction is that you have a bunch of things that you take as a given, and then you have a bunch of rules that you follow. Why the heck should you prefer one set of givens and one set of rules over another set? Well, because
Right.
you like, and if you're the only reason you would avoid this is if you're afraid of circularity. But as he just noted, rule circularity is not a problem. So yay, we don't. It's not a problem.
I mean, how do you? Well, like I said earlier, rule circularity itself could just be addressed by saying, okay, why is rule circularity virtuous, whereas premise circularity is vicious? And
I would say,
because premise circularity is a fallacy.
no, it's not. Well, yes, it is, but like it's the name. Suppose so. This is how
Frank, can you not interrupt yourself, please?
It's a big question.
Frank, stop interrupting Frank.
This is how I like. This is the way I answer extreme skepticism and presuppositionalism requires me to have an extremely nuanced view of the circular fallacy. So, how I refute presuppositionalism is roughly this. How do I know that things are as they are? Because they seem that way, and my cognitive faculties are reliable. It's like, how do you know your cognitive faculties are reliable? Because they tell me so. It's like, well, that's circular. It's like, well, I have a very simple argument that can't be a problem. If I know something, I know it by those means whereby I know things. For if I knew it by any other means, then I wouldn't know it, because it would be means whereby I didn't know things. So I can only know things by those means whereby I know things. Yet if I know anything, if I know whether my cognitive faculties are in fact reliable, I must know it by those means whereby I know things. And so I may appeal. And so unless I know nothing, I may appeal to my cognitive faculties to justify my cognitive faculties. And I believe that all valid circular arguments are going to have this type of justification. There's going to be some overarching rule which is going to say if some condition holds, then you can appeal to the thing itself.
Well, look at it like this, though. Personify your cognitive faculties and put it on the witness stand.
What do you mean?
Are you going to be, just for a thought experiment, personify it, personify your cognitive faculties, and let's put it on a witness stand. And we're going to ask, and what's before the court is the witness trustworthy? Is there a way to verify the trustworthiness of the witness without cross-examining the witness?
Wait, but the problem is...
Tom, what's up, man?
Yeah, hello.
Where have you been?
Well, just checking you out. But the problem is, who is the court?
That's the point. Yeah, it's
yeah,
absurd.
It is.
Yeah, the court setting is absurd. So that's why a lot of philosophers like Alston and different epistemologists say there is no non-circular way to justify the reliability of your cognitive faculties.
My point is that,
in a sense, I would agree. Yeah, there is no uncircular court.
I know I'm getting closer to the truth when Tom agrees with me. That's good.
unless you really go way out to say there's infinite regress in both directions. When you ask what caused A, well, A star caused A, and what caused A star? A double star caused A star, and stuff. There's an infinite regress. What does A cause? It causes B, and B causes C, and stuff like that. Unless you go this route, there is no way to avoid circular reasoning in a sense.
Well, that does seem to me that you know, again, I'm going to say something. All you guys tear it down, please, because I'm sure it's wrong, but I don't know why it's wrong. Okay, so it does seem to me that the justification for purely deductive arguments, obviously, to me, seems like an infinite regress. But when I look at the infinite regress in the problem of induction, although it's still an infinite regress, the more you regress into the past, the more accurate the answer becomes.
Yeah,
right? Which by an internal judgment of what the arguments are, that would seem to be self-affirming, not an infinite regress.
yeah. You get more and more justification, like more and more justification to be more certain about what you are concluding in the end. But
Yeah.
you can never reach 100%. That is what the presuppositionalists, for example, say.
Sure, but with the deductive
don't-
argument, Tom, with the deductive argument, you're never getting more certain, right? It's the justifications of the previous premises are just going to be deductive arguments, which themselves need premises to be justified.
Right? Sure. The deductive arguments always rely on the premises. If the premises,
right,
depending on how much certain the premises are, the deductive argument based on these premises are a certain.
Right.
It
seems we can never have 100% there either, and the best we can do there is to guess. Whereas with the induction, at least we're not guessing, are we? We're getting more certain.
Yeah,
we're just never being certain.
In my opinion, yeah, that's true.
Right. So, Frank, I'd like to hear what you've got to say on it, because I think you might have something which could enlighten me.
I'm not sure I understand. Like I agree that deductive arguments the conclusion is no more certain than the conjunction of the conclusion of the certainty of the conclusion of the premise. So it's like if you model it probabilistically, the conclusion is either equal to or less than the certainty of any given premise.
Mm-hmm.
But induction, in induction, the conclusions serve to increase the certainty of the premise. So the conclusion, the premises serve to increase the certainty of the conclusion, right? So I agree with that. But like at that point, I don't see where anything I said before disagrees with it. It just so happens.
It's saying now take that back and say, well, how are those premises justified, and how are those premises justified, and how are those premises justified?
You know, there's a sense.
What's the pattern? Are we getting more certain, or are we getting equally as certain, or are we getting less certain?
I believe that there's sort of two systems in place that sort of work out. There's a set of so like you can't say whether or not your inductions work unless you have a background metaphysics and whatnot, which makes it so that they can. So if you're like a Humean, there's no regularity in nature, or there's no causal principles, there's no dispositions, there's no universals, there's no connections between universals. It's just the world is such that you just see constant conjunctions of events, in which case you have no reason to expect whatever. So what happens is that the answer is contentful. It's not merely formal. It's not a question of, oh, let's do this probabilistic logic to see how the certainty increases on numerically. No, there's this underlying philosophy that goes around, and I believe that that's all grounded in a very transcendental arguments and in certain types of arguments which are rule circular, right? They all are.
Yeah, they're assumptions. You have to make an assumption at the beginning to get anything. Yeah.
And I think the ultimate argument of that is the argument I gave roughly. If you know something, you know it by those means or by you know things, and then everything that and so if you know that your cognitive faculties are reliable, your cognitive faculties are those means whereby you know things. So you would know it by itself.
So do you think that these assumptions
this is true
can be justified? Sorry,
go ahead. What
do you think do you think those assumptions that you make can be justified or can never be justified? Say again.
I think that my cognitive faculties, I think it's self-evident that my cognitive faculties are generally reliable. They don't have to be reliable, but it doesn't even make sense for me to say that they're not reliable, that they're not. I cannot meaningfully deny the claim that they're.
Indeed. Do you think that's a justification for them?
Yes, I think so. I believe that one, you justify it in roughly this way. One, it's so you get sort of like a phenomenal conservatism, but it seems to be the case that something seems to be the case, and that's a positive condition. The negative condition is you have no reason to believe that it's not. You have no reason to doubt your seemings, and in that case, that is certain. That's complete certainty. Now that's defeasible, right? Like something can seem to be the case, and then you can get reason, and you can at a given time you can have it so that you have no reason to believe otherwise. But then another time you get a reason, and so there's a defeat. Your seeming to being inference is defeated. So you say things seem to be the case. I have no reason to believe that my seemings are wrong. Therefore, they are the case. That's the inference, and then that can change over time. But there are certain claims which you cannot, in principle, have a reason to believe otherwise. So I cannot, in principle, have a reason to believe that I don't exist. Because if I didn't exist, there would be no me to have a reason to believe otherwise. So that claim is that claim. It seems to me that so first, the positive conditions. It seems to me like the positive justification is it seems to me that I exist. That claim seems to be true. The negative justification is it cannot in principle be false. Like it cannot in principle seem to be false. Like I cannot even get the concept.
Right. Okay. That's fine. So that's about you.
Really,
so can you not then make the same assumption about the external world?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you could, like, you could actually have reason to believe that the external world. Well, you can't have reason to believe that no external world exists, right? So, but like you could say that maybe, like, so there are certain skeptical scenarios which I'd say. So for example, I can be completely confident that I'm not in an evil demon scenario. That I'm not that base reality isn't such that I can't get out of it. Right? I can't get out of the matrix, as it were, because in that case, the deception is parasitic upon veridicality. I can't have an illusory seeming without there being an actual thing to seem that way. So if it doesn't actually make sense for an evil demon to be deceiving me, because they're deceiving me with what is seeming to be the case that isn't the case. How could I even have a concept of other minds if I've never experienced them? Like, or how can I even have a concept of? So there's conditions on how you have a concept of a thing which are there. But if I was in the matrix, I can have illusory seemings of other minds, because there can in reality be other minds which these simulations were built to mimic. So and then I can get the same thing with dreaming, right? Like I could be dreaming right now, but I could come to learn, like when I wake up, I learn that I was dreaming, and so now it seems to me that things are real. Now I could go that indefinitely, but there's never a time where I can doubt that there is some external world, because there is some such thing as other minds, that there is some such thing as an external world, because I wouldn't even have the concept of an external world otherwise. Okay, I wouldn't. That's not that I wouldn't. I couldn't have it.
Are you implying Gödel's incompleteness theorem here?
I'm not commenting on Gödel's incompleteness theorem, but it's related because you have this. It's related.
It is. Yeah.
Okay. So given the external world, then would you not grant that there are relationships in that external world which have a priori meaning, even if we have to use descriptive words to get to what that is?
I grant that. I don't. I mean, like, assuming I think I understand what you're saying. I might not be understanding you, but like.
Well, that's the uniformity of nature, then.
Yeah. There are laws of physics that underline things, but but see, what that means is that Humeanism is false, right? There are certain views which just you can't know,
exactly,
and so you can't accept as a like if they were true, you couldn't know anything. Among them is Humeanism, so you have to take either a Platonic or a more Aristotelian kind of view. You have to take a dispositions view or a physical law view. You have to view laws or dispositions as real.
Although
I'm not sure. Dispositions. Well, go ahead, Max, because I'm out of my depths.
In terms of dispositions, have you ever seen that optical illusion where you have two lines? One has an arrow on each side pointing outwards, so like this. Whereas the other line has those arrows point towards.
It's
that
one line is short.
Yeah, most people are psychologically disposed to thinking that that one line is longer than the other, when in fact the lines are both the same size. It's just the outer lines make it look such that one is bigger than the other. That's all that's meant by disposition. And in terms of dispositions, as they connect to morality, if one grants a phenomenal conservatism, then I think one has to also grant that morals, at the very least, have give one the disposition that they are objective. Most people, the common sense view is that morality has some objectivity about it. That's why we have dispositions to believe that there are certain acts which one ought never do, and certain acts which one ought to do.
Now, really? Because when you say never there, you're changing the meaning of objective to absolute.
Oh, just to clarify then, we have intuitions about propositions about which actions we ought to do in a case and which ones we don't. And we also have a feeling that there is a correct way of viewing it. Which one? We have a view where there's, in fact, a correct way of doing things, and a view where there's an incorrect way of doing things. Like, you ought to have done that. Yeah. And this isn't to say that you couldn't get to moral subjectivity or make an argument against moral realism. But yeah, I think if on phenomenal conservatism, the burden of proof would have to be on the anti-realist or the non-cognitivist.
I'm not quite denying that, though. I would have to ask again. I don't consider myself a phenomenal conservative because I have this extra. I'm very similar to. I take my own approach to it. So it might just be semantics, but I consider myself an externalist, and phenomenal conservatives are internalists. So, but like that again, it might just be the weirdness of the definitions of. I don't actually like the distinction between internalism and externalism in the first place. So,
myself.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny that. Like, I am a moral realist, right? Like, I just don't know how to ground it. So I'm a realist. I believe that there are these things. I trust my intuitions as to the existence of morals because I have no reason to believe otherwise, and because I do in fact have those intuitions. Like, that's the joke. But I don't know how to ground them, right? And I'm actually leaning towards theism, but I have to. But there's, it doesn't. Like, things have to be the case. So it doesn't seem to me that anything that you would. There's all kinds of stuff that goes into it.
Have you ever thought about socialism as a grounding?
I don't know how what.
Socialism. Well, that's the ought, isn't it?
Look, if you really want to be a theist and you just can't bring yourself, you can believe in me. I'll be your God.
The reason I'm not a theist is because the arguments for the God do not persuade me that the thing argued for has a mind. But
yeah.
But I'm persuaded that there is some source of things, and the good could be grounded in that. But actually, I don't yet have an argument for it, so I don't want to say that. But like, the good is probably grounded. It seems to me that the good is going to. There's going to be an argument that the good is grounded in that. Is grounded in this. But I do not. It does not seem to yet seem to me.
Yes, but in that sense, I'm also a theist, right?
I'm not saying that I'm a theist. I would only identify as a theist the moment I can say that thing has a mind.
It's that like most of the arguments for God, such as Thomist arguments, and those things to a degree work for me, and I have the same problem, and I don't see how that thing has a mind or has intentions or has why there would be a teleology to anything
or any explanatory.
It's literally like you're taking a label, writing God on it, and then taking it to that first cause, uncaused cause, whatever, and sticking the label God on it.
There are proofs that it has a mind, right? Like, if you read the Summa, they have proofs. They're just really weird.
There are arguments. There are proofs.
Like, flawed analogies.
Wait, Barney, why don't you believe that the pilot wave theory is actually God? Doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. Doesn't have to be intelligent. Doesn't have to be an agent. But it is determining everything
that's
in
why
the universe.
I was a
This is why I kind of like the moral argument, kind of moral argument for God's existence.
No,
It's
there
very
is no
easy.
more argument. It's just a pilot wave theory.
Oh, actually, of course, there's a moral argument, and they're valid.
What?
The soundness, of course, there are moral arguments, and a lot of them are valid. I think it's really the soundness a lot of people dispute. So, for example, I like the moral perfection argument too, which is my personal favorite. If we ought to do something, then it entails we can do it. Like that strikes me as incontroversial.
I object.
What's your objection?
Sorry,
oh,
you're saying all conceptual things we ought physically to be able to do.
Right. If you expect
That doesn't
someone,
seem logical.
I mean, from the perspective of a moral law, if one is in a position where one could do it, one could not do it, then it would be irrational to expect that that person ought to do it. I mean, if somebody was tied up and blindfolded, and you expected them to stop a crime, well, that's just, yeah. Okay.
Sure, with that limitation on it, yeah, okay. We're human,
right.
yeah.
So yeah, exactly.
So the system itself is going to be flawed.
Exactly. Now the second premise is we ought to be morally perfect, and this one is more controversial. But as a defense of it, imagine the converse was true. We ought not be morally perfect. Okay, there's no obligation to be morally perfect, and it would be odd for one to expect as such because human beings fail all the time. I've never come across the perfect angel. Or the perfect exemplar of a human being. No one has, from an empirical perspective. And so that kind of gives us good reason to believe that's not really naturally possible. And yet, if we were to commit a crime of some sort and we were to be taken in front of a judge, I'm willing to bet for certain that the judge would not say, would not hear out me saying, okay, look, when it comes to you expect me to follow the law? Everyone's got to break the law eventually. This just happens to be the time where I broke it, and you can't really expect human beings to be good all the time.
There is in the same way that there is no compulsion for you to be perfectly moral. You are imperfect, and you can, but there is no reason why somebody should forgive you for your transgressions, right? Well, yes, you have faltered and broke this rule, and now you will be punished. Why is that a problem?
Because the first premise was ought implies can. If you've accepted that one, then there's always going to be some rational expectation. If the judge doesn't have. Yeah, I mean, the judge himself doesn't have to.
The judge can say, "Yes, I understand, and I agree with you. You will have to sit in jail for 2 years for that."
I have a question to Max. I have a question to Max.
No, sure.
Does it mean that somebody who isn't aware of Jesus Christ, but he does do everything all right, according to the law, that he will be judged as, okay, I give you a pass, you go to heaven, so to speak, even though he didn't know the law, because there is an ought and there is an is, and he fulfilled the ought. He actually did the is perfectly, but he didn't know about Jesus Christ, so he would then pass on to heaven, right? Or not?
Ignorata juris non excusat, or ignorance of the law is no excuse. And by that, what I mean is, so no one actually goes to hell for not being a Christian. It's a counterfront. By that I mean, if one is to go to hell, it's not because they didn't accept Christ as their personal savior, although that would have prevented it. Rather, rather you're judged not based off of that whether or not you've met that kind of obligation. What you're judged upon is whether or not you have committed a sin, and one sin to an infinitely good God is, of course, deserving of an infinite punishment. So that's
Max,
how it was.
isn't that quite heretical?
No.
No, the two commandments of Christ are
love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as you would love yourself.
And if you're not a Christian, how can you love your God with all your heart?
How can you? If you're not a well, I mean, of course you'd be breaking that. Of course you'd be
exactly.
Yeah. So, but all right, and that kind of goes right, and that does kind of go into the whole ignorance of the law is no excuse. But on the other hand, if one is ignorant of that, then really, I don't think it would be blameworthy for that particular transgression. I think it would probably apply to.
Why would you excuse it? Why?
I mean, that's
grounds. It's insulting God. There's no obligation to forgive anybody.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is if the
that's
person
how it works out ultimately.
Right. Well, another way to think about it is if that person was ignorant of that particular commandment, then it would be pretty hard for them to live up to it. But usually in Catholicism,
it's not true either, because even those who have the law screw up.
Yeah, well, to be honest, Jesus.
Let me ask a very specific
condition, not a sufficient one.
Let me ask a very specific question. There is an island. Maybe you've heard about the island.
Are you going to talk about the great worshippers?
Cargo cults.
No, not necessarily. There is an island in the Andamans that is somewhere west of Singapore, I guess, the Andaman Islands. There is an island of it's a remote island and it belongs to India, and the government of India has actually restricted access to these islands because they fear that the indigenous people on the island could be they could be accessed by viruses, diseases, and whatever, that they wouldn't survive. Whatever, they are like off limits. Nobody is allowed to even approach the island. On the other hand, the people on this island are actually seem to be cannibals. So if you go there and you want to spread the word of Jesus, you're probably getting cooked and eaten. So good luck with that. But anyways, these people seem to be not aware of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So what about these people? Are they condemned to go to hell?
Well,
yes.
Or not?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good. So that
everyone who is condemned to go to hell. You're already condemned.
Wait.
Everybody is condemned except else, I guess.
Wait, could I answer the question because it was posed to me? So this is what I would say. God tells us how to get to heaven, but He doesn't. But that's not to say it is the only way that God may pass on His grace. So, for example, the Catholic Church has not declared anyone to be in any particular individual to be in hell, aside from the demons. Yet, so what I would say is, if any one of those people died, I couldn't say that they were in hell. I couldn't affirm that they were in heaven, though, and I would leave their fate to be, the hands of an all just but all merciful God. However, if He was to, working on this supposition that God was to withhold His grace from them and they were damned to hell, God would be fully within His right to do so. But if He was to give His grace and let them into heaven, He would also be in His rights to do so.
It's a mystery. So it seems contradictory that if not believing in Jesus is a sin, right? And yet Jesus died for the sins of mankind, that Jesus didn't die for the right not to believe in Jesus. So why would that be a barrier to getting into heaven?
Can I do devil's advocate? Because
go ahead.
So it's not a, so the only time it's a sin not to believe is when you've already heard, right? The thing is, you're already sinning.
That's fine. But Jesus died for my right to sin, right?
No.
No, that's not why he died. So the understanding is Jesus died not as a lot of people like to frame it in a sense of I'm trying to think of the form of atonement theory that most Calvinists substitutionary atonement. When Jesus dies on the cross, he dies so that he takes on your punishment for sin. From what I understand, that's not the case. Right. From what I understand, when Jesus goes to the cross and dies, what he does is he's performing this very virtuous and exemplificatory act, and in doing so, Jesus Christ gets a superabundance of grace from God the Father. This is grace Jesus Christ doesn't need because he's already sinless, born sinless, from his divine nature.
Infinite grace, anyway.
Infinite
doesn't
grace,
matter whether you've got a sin or not. Yeah.
Right, and from this, if anyone was to be a part of his church covenant, that is, become a Catholic, baptized into the church, that superabundance is some of that grace is given to you, such that you yourself are put in a state of grace. That way it counterbalances the grace you have lost in performing your sins.
Right.
And
so if the grace I've lost is the sin of not believing in Jesus, then I'm okay with that still, because he's covering it with extra grace.
Oh no, God doesn't just give you that grace when you're just born. You have to be baptized.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I have to be baptized, right? I mean,
also there's a original.
That seems somewhat parochial. I mean, it's somewhat local, right?
Simos, did you not get baptized, Simos?
I don't think so. I might have done, actually. Yeah, I think I might have done.
You better do that just in case.
Well, it was up to my mother, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as an infant, as an adult, you have to believe and be baptized. As an infant, it's a covenantal thing. But
right. Seems very local. Anyway, seems very local.
It is.
And certainly not objective in the sense of universal.
It's objective in the sense that, like, if you do it, you get, and other things don't happen, you go to heaven.
Yeah. It's a conditional universal. If any human was to do it, then any human would be in a state of grace.
Right.
But
sure.
Not necessarily.
So Jesus didn't die for all men's sins, just some.
He did. Oh, so there's a distinction to be had between Jesus dying for all men in the sense of, I believe it's the difference between efficacious.
Yeah, efficacious versus sufficient grace.
Whether or not Jesus' atonement was efficaciously universal, or whether it was potentially universal. Efficacious means as soon as he did that, all men were bestowed grace.
Yeah.
That's not the case. Potential just means Jesus Christ died so all men could potentially have grace.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Shame it wasn't stipulated in the text, but okay.
Yeah, and I just want
to provide you the means to get to heaven. Right? It's sufficient that if you use those means are sufficient to get to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Just you choose whether or not to use the means, given that you.
I believe Owchywawa wants to comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's not necessarily a sin not to believe in Jesus, because there's a such thing as invincible ignorance, where you're not when you don't know that. When you don't know that Jesus is, say, the Savior out of no fault of your own, then you can't. Then it's not a sin.
Yeah. I granted that win.
So would that apply to this to the tribe living on that island in the Andaman Islands west of Singapore?
Yes, because they didn't accept Jesus Christ, because they never got a chance to accept or reject Jesus Christ, they wouldn't be judged for that particular act. They could be judged for any of their other sins because they have a notion of morality built within them, and other and in light of that, that's how they're judged in terms of the natural order. So,
Would a tribe that actually performs actions that would contradict your sense of this moral compass is inscribed upon your heart, and they would contradict or they would act against this moral compass, would that actually be, I guess, um, a cause or an argument against you saying that everybody has this moral compass inscribed on his heart?
no, not at all, because sometimes we know things that we intentionally act in contradiction to. There are definitely times when people believe in A, and yet they act as if A is not the case. So
But
sometimes,
how would you come to the conclusion that if a tribe of, let's say, cannibals somewhere in Africa, okay, Africa is rather well established right now, but let's say a tribe on this very remote islands, they have a totally different culture and moral ethics, let's say, and they totally contradict of what you say God has inscribed on their hearts. So they totally go against that. So how would you explain that?
In other words, the question is: do you think that cannibals and those who perform human sacrifices also believe that it's wrong by their moral standards, but they just do it?
yeah, I would say something.
Yeah,
I would say that they have. I would say that they have the proper epistemic resources to conclude that such a thing is wrong, yet they do not follow it all the way. An interesting kind of parallel is consider slavery during the Confederacy. There were plenty of people in the world who actually, let's even take slavery when it was instituted all over the United States. Great Britain was actually the first empire to want to ban slavery, and they did it. And there were plenty of abolitionists who recognized that slavery was immoral. They didn't have any different epistemic tools than the slavers in the South or in the rest of the United States, and yet they came to the right conclusion. So that's kind of the explanation I would give there. And it's not really just a matter of you can find it in swaths of people like Charles Darwin, who was an avowed abolitionist. He had the proper tools to get to that conclusion. You could find it in people like John Wesley, the guy who started Methodism. He was also an abolitionist. They had the same epistemic tools and resources that Jefferson Davis did, and yet Jefferson Davis thought that slavery was not only morally right, but it was worthy to go to war over. So yeah,
I have a question.
I don't think that's correct.
Why not?
You can quote me here. You can take snippets from. If I was living 300 years ago, I would probably be all right with slavery. Just saying. Just because the sort of how I would have brought up and what information I had to and what kind of moral foundations I would have formed at that time, I would have said, "Oh, slavery is totally fine. Don't worry about it." But nowadays, I don't live 300 years ago. I live right now, so I say slavery is totally wrong. So I think there is a kind of moral relativism going on here, and
Yeah, I think you're conflating something. When I said I'm not suggesting that there aren't people who would be okay with slavery. I'm full. That's part of my whole point. Yes, there are people who would Jefferson Davis was fully okay with slavery. He lived quite a while ago. Yet at the same time, I could also point to contemporaries, people who lived around the same time, such as Darwin, such as Wesley, and yet they came to very different and opposite conclusions. And the reason is because one group of people reasoned properly and morally, and the other reasoned to the opposite extreme. I think that when you look at their arguments, the abolitionists made the better argument. They had the better justifications for their position, and I would side there. Because when it comes to ethical dialogue, we're not just shouting at each other. We are actually making points. We're invoking principles, and that is kind of the source of our ability to reason about these kinds of things. When I'm talking to a vegan about veganism, I'm not an ethical vegan, but I thought, like, I can understand their arguments. I might not agree with them, but at least when it comes to that form of debate, I understand what they're putting forward. Their arguments are either right or they're wrong. I'm going to conclude. I've concluded so far that they're wrong until such a time when I'm convinced. But that's not to say it's relative.
Yeah, but let's assume for a moment that veganism is going to conquer the world. Like in 300 years from now, nobody's eating meat. Everybody's a vegan, right? And then they look back at us and say, "Oh my God, these horrible people! They were so backwards. They actually ate animal flesh as food, like to survive. Like how backwards were they?" Now we can take this perspective now and say, like, what did people 300 years back from nowadays, what did they think? And they thought like slavery was okay most of the time. Like most of the people thought like slavery is okay, no worry about that. Why do you want to even raise the issue, right? But so that's the problem. Like, how do you say that we have a moral basis right now compared to 300 years before or 300 years into the future? If you want to project, could be all kinds of things happening, and then the people in the future would look at us like total barbarians.
Oh, very simple. I don't think vegans have a good moral basis. It's as simple as that. I can give you reasons why that's the case. But in terms of wait. In terms of
I would agree with you on the vegan thing.
But yeah, I'm going to address what you said about them taking over the world. If it is the case that vegans were to take over the world and their view became the most dominant, predominant, then all I would say there is that just shows the view is popular. It doesn't show that it's correct. The second thing I'd say is there might even be more non-moral reasons veganism became so popular. Consider the fact that it's more environmentally friendly, which I'll fully admit the vegan is correct on. It might be. It doesn't show that eating meat is in itself unethical in principle, just only when it causes environmental damage. But when it comes to the past, I still think you could understand the arguments. I'd like to think when I oppose slavery, it's not because of the time and place I live, but rather I have a good argument. And if I was to go 300 years into the past and live as a white person, then I could side with abolitionists and give arguments why the slaver's position is wrong, and I'd still be okay.
And you can't see that with the vegan argument. You can't see the superiority of it over meat eating.
I actually think that veganism is the better diet. I think on a pragmatic level, it's healthier. I think it's more environmentally friendly and conscious. I just don't think killing an animal and eating its meat is wrong. That's the only part, or in principle wrong. That's the only thing I disagree with vegans on, ethical vegans on.
Sure. I was saying superior. I wasn't necessarily saying that the other was wrong. Per se.
Okay, right.
I think veganism is just speciesism in a sense, but that's just my 2 cents.
And I think meat eating is not quite as widespread as you. I mean, large parts of the world are vegetarian, just through necessity more than anything.
Necessity.
But also practicality in some sense in some areas.
Sure.
And it seems to me the natural way that the species would go if we want to keep our numbers as high as we do.
Right. And it takes up less water, and
it's a luxury.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't want to spark a vegan debate here, but
that's cool.
Just
that's cool. We need to wait. We need to find ways to supplement what we're losing by not eating meat, because there's an evolutionary argument as to why we've got teeth that are meat eating, right?
Exactly. In terms of the argument I was kind of making earlier for the existence of God on ethics, the first premise was ought implies can, or if I ought to do something, then it follows I could do it. I ought to be morally perfect. Then we started talking about a bunch of other things, but I think my main point was just if we have an expectation to be morally perfect, it means that we can be morally perfect. But But on a naturalistic basis, I don't really see how that would be possible to find a morally perfect individual. And because from what I've seen empirically, all humans by their own power and capacity fail to follow basic the law.
That's the issue, though, right? Because there might be many ways to achieve the same outcome. You're assuming there's only one way to achieve that outcome. Just like in nature, that's when we reflect nature, right? There is, the altruistic behavior of mammals, for instance, right, is noted in nature. It's not just a human construct.
Of course. When it comes to other animals exhibiting moral behavior, I'm willing to admit I see it in nature. But the point is that human beings fail at it, because we're just like any other animal. In light of that, and let's see.
Well, specifically a type of animal. I mean, we're not like. I mean, we are like other animals, of course, because we're an animal. But specifically, we're a mammal, and so we go after a particular type of mammal that has a particular type of social setup, right? We're not just any type of mammal that just, we can be loners. Well, no, we can't be loners. Truly, we can't.
No, the closest thing you come to is in an indie alt band and sings out there, but that's about it. So what I would posit is actually the only world religion that I could think of that has kind of that path where human beings attain some kind of moral perfection is Christianity. And the reason I would posit Christianity,
Jainism.
And also there's quite a few, obviously.
But Jainism would entail that at some point human beings are incarnated to a point. Well, most Nirvana-esque religions believe that at a certain point you become incarnated so much that eventually you'll achieve Nirvana. But from an empirical view,
what is the goal?
Nirvana.
Perfection.
Perfection.
Yeah. Right. Perfect. In terms of in terms of Hinduism, in terms of Eastern religions that usually espouse some kind of reincarnation, what I would say there is, I don't really see any empirical evidence of people attaining nirvana. It's all.
Come on now, Max. Come on, you can't say something like that. They've got gurus over there that can levitate, that can raise the dead, that they can
demonic powers.
They can produce gems out of their sleeve, for goodness sake.
How can you say that and not how can you do you believe those miracles? Because I'm kind of curious as how you would identify as being an atheist.
I put those miracles on the same basis that I put like you saying the resurrection is true.
When I say no miracle,
tongue in cheek.
Oh, I see. So when I said no empirical evidence, what I mean to say is there's no empirical evidence where I would expect it, because we've had billions of human beings on the face of the earth, billions of opportunities to be reincarnated, and I'd expect to see a specific class of people like right at their final life where they are going to achieve nirvana, and yet
Absolutely. Hume is correct.
I have one
How do you
question
not-
here. I
But
have
how
one
do you not
question
see
here.
that same class of
Yeah.
problem with Christianity?
Cognitive dissonance is strong right now.
Not
Hume
really.
is correct.
Wait, because
I
I can answer that because I just want to answer that first.
Sure.
Okay, so the reason is the crucifixion and the resurrection is one event that happened in the past. I don't expect people to have direct empirical evidence for history. Whereas there are plenty of historical events that have left very little evidence for them. There are historical mysteries; those exist, or that aren't mentioned, or have very scant evidence. I would expect that's not something that. Whereas what you see with what would you expect with Eastern religions, were whole swaths or classes of people at their final life. That would be a reoccurring thing that you would see socially within the world. So that's the difference I see.
Well, I mean, they claim you do see it, of course, but you know.
I haven't.
In fact, everything you see is a demonstration of it.
So I have one.
Another issue with Jainism is, of course, if we're talking about moral perfection, from a Catholic perspective, moral perfection only happens when you obtain union with God. And since Jainism, in Jainism, they don't believe in God, you can't really obtain moral perfection in Jainism from our perspective.
But definitional.
From the Catholic perspective.
Yeah, there's incommensurability going on.
Yeah.
The Catholics definitely say that as well, don't they?
Right. But that's why.
The
But that's why
Catholics have to rule that out.
That's somewhat of an argument. I'm right, therefore they're wrong.
Well, no, you can make philosophical arguments for the fact that all human beings are directed by nature to God,
right,
which
that would be sort of like the arguments I was using before. So, like, I can rule out Hume's view immediately because it refutes, it destroys the possibility of knowledge. Right now, Hume's view, you would expect the phenomenology would be exactly the same. Like, Hume's view is no less falsifiable in that sense than the dispositions view or the laws view. Like, there actually are natural laws, or there actually are dispositions, rather than just being constant conjunction of events. But if there were only constant conjunction of events, I couldn't know. So it doesn't even make sense for it to seem for there to, like, I can't, I couldn't, it's not merely that I couldn't know that there were constant conjunction events. I couldn't know what it means for there to be. So if I know what it means for there to be a constant conjunction of events, and I do, then that's not the way reality is, right? So either I know nothing, or Hume's view is wrong.
Or we're just, let's not go down that route. That seems to me.
In the same way, the Catholic the idea is that the ultimate religious view, or the ultimate worldview, whatever, is going to have a series of those types of arguments. You can eliminate things as being, implying universal ignorance, and then you can refute universal ignorance in other ways. Like, I can counter the skeptic,
okay. Oh, I don't know. I thought Max was saying that the fact that they claim perfection and then clearly they don't demonstrate it was an argument against Eastern religion.
No, that's not my argument. My argument isn't that they don't demonstrate it. If, for example, they said once you die, you go off to another planet, and on that planet you start working on nirvana, then okay, I wouldn't expect some kind of empirical evidence for that. That's just not demonstrable.
I see.
You're right, but if there is some kind of expected empirical evidence, then, and I don't see it, then that does, on the converse, falsify the religion. That's what I'm saying.
Granted. Okay, so you're saying that they don't appear to be getting better,
right? There doesn't seem to be.
We would expect them to be getting better if indeed reincarnation was a real thing.
Not necessarily the Jains, but exactly the Jains, but just anybody, or like if there was a specific class of people that that were throughout their whole lives sinless, had no imperfections. We're just doing all these. We're just these people with no flaw at all, and it was a reoccurring thing that just kept on happening with a visible class of people. Then I would actually see that as being very affirming to the Jain position.
Yeah, but I see that as completely equivalent to a lot of Christian claims where if you ask them, they would say that those people exist. The gurus are those people.
Yeah.
That there are constantly reoccurring through history specific individuals who are obviously very near in their last life before nirvana or one of the last lives before nirvana.
Indeed.
Right? And they will claim that these people have exquisite morality, exquisite abilities that only come about through that process.
Well, you can't rule that out, Barney.
Well, I can't rule it.
So, all right, right. So, in light of that, I'd ask for specific examples, and I'd also like to ask how often do they come around? Because if this is just one or two people diffused throughout history.
They're very, very common. They are very common in India. People are representing themselves as gurus all the time, and some of them actually get believed to be gurus on a level which you would find unbelievable, I'm sure.
I probably might. I'd have to investigate it myself.
This is very famous. There are famous examples where people have had millions and millions of followers on the basis that they do miracles.
That's true, but doing miracles does not necessarily entail one is morally perfect. There are so, for example, Moses did miracles in the Bible.
It is.
Their argument is that in that last stage, right before you attain nirvana and divinity, you do start showing aspects of that divinity.
Yeah, Max, it's moral perfection as understood by the whatever the name of the religion is. It's not moral perfection in the right, or your view of moral perfection. It's whatever they view moral perfection, but they view moral perfection in such a way that if you can perform these miracles, that is indicative of moral perfection.
So when I say
of divinity, which itself is indicative of moral perfection.
Yeah.
Right. When I say moral perfection, I mean something along the lines of they always obey the obligations that they are supposed to. So. Or the duties that they are supposed to.
Yeah, but you would work.
Their very actions themselves are moral.
But have they ever committed any kind of wrongdoing?
No, never.
Oh, okay. So
I mean, again, according to their moral system.
According to their and according to their claims.
Okay, according to their so I would have to ask what is their moral system. I'd have to ask about what their moral system is, and what kind of actions are entailed to be.
Yeah. So this is what I was saying earlier. What you're going to do is you're going to do an internal analysis of their worldview, and you're going to rip it apart. You're going to use the type of argument that I was talking about earlier on.
Exactly. And I mean that's what
philosophically that you can't say that that's actually going on. That when they say that they're perceiving moral perfection, they're either saying that from an inconsistent view or. You basically do what presuppositionalists do.
Sure, and that's the point. That's the point the atheists are making, isn't it? Is they look the same from the outside, as much as you, as much as I can talk to somebody like this that has justifications as to why perfection is achieved and it's demonstratable in the real world, and in fact, the real world is a demonstration of the very fact that they're talking about perfection. Just shows to me personally, because I don't have any of these presuppositions of belief in an external being, that when I look at Christianity, I hear there's exactly the same thing being said. We're all aspiring to act like Jesus. We're all aspiring to follow his teachings, but none of us can actually do that because we're not Jesus. That's exactly the same argument that the Buddhists give, right? Of saying, well, of course, you can never achieve perfection, but the goal is perfection. And once you do, it's possible in our religion because you then move on to a place called nirvana, which is not of this world, and you're constantly there, eternal life. And that's exactly the same thing.
But here's the thing: it doesn't really help the atheist because at the very most, it just shows the atheist that they have to pick between some kind of Eastern religion or Christianity. based off of some other kind of argument. But in any case,
No,
If-
if
It
there
doesn't.
if there
Wait,
is a
wait.
multiplicity of equal
Wait, wait.
claims with
Yeah,
equal evidence, then I can doubt all of them. I can
Yeah, but
confront
bring it
all
up
of
to
them with
the
each
not-
other and say, "Oh, this is all unreliable. I
Connection is
just
trouble.
don't know."
no. So, in response to the moral perfection argument, if you acknowledge that it's possible to be morally perfect, then you are stuck actually seeking out which of the belief systems have the most evidence to confirm or back up such a claim. You could be
Sure.
agnostic.
If you think morals are absolute, I grant you
Yeah.
that would be the case. Yeah. I don't
Okay.
grant that morals are absolute.
Objective.
Well, I'm using the word absolute.
No, I think all you need for them to be
I
is
have a
objective, not
question.
necessarily absolute.
Well, I would
Then
disagree
they
on
be
what
what?
you mean by objective
Sorry.
on some
Can you
sense, so I want to avoid that word.
Max, can you repeat? That they be what?
Objective.
Objective. Oh.
And I think he means objective in the universal sense, right?
Okay, definition time again. So my understanding is that objective means outside of the control of the agent, and subjective means defined by the agent or in control of the agent.
So subjective means true. So a proposition is subjective whenever it is true, based solely upon the preference of the subject. So, for example, if I were to say chocolate ice cream is better than if I was to say mint chocolate ice cream is the best ice cream, which it is, but that would not be true because of some kind of property mint chocolate ice cream has. That's just
Sure.
What
do you mean by objective, Max?
Oh, what I mean by objective is when a proposition is true in light of something other. In light of so a proposition is objective whenever it is true, in part because of some external set of affairs.
Okay, so the morality that I was describing earlier, it's an objective morality, but it is different set of morals for each individual.
Then
So-
it's it's
Right.
highly then it's agent relative.
Yes,
Okay, so
it's agent relative, but it is objective.
Exactly.
So it's objective, but it's not universal. It's individual.
Whereas when you just described objective, you were saying it was independent of minds. And that's the bit that I argue with, right? That means it's absolute in my mind, right? But when we're saying it's dependent upon minds,
Then it's
right,
relative.
not any one mind, then we're saying it's objective, right? Because morals necessarily are about human interaction.
So I think one has to. So yeah, usually whenever people
Or agents
respond-
interaction, I should
Right.
say.
Right. So whenever people usually bring this up regarding God, people conflate the truth and moral propositions being grounded in his ontology, in his character, as opposed to his mind or preference. So, for example, if I was to say John is loving, it's not because of the fact that John has some kind of subjective disposition, or true solely because John thinks in such a way, but rather he has certain character traits that we tie into being loving. So if I said John is loving and he's a real asshole, then yeah, I find that hard to believe, objectively speaking.
Probably
right.
loves himself, Max.
I'm sorry,
Probably loves himself, Max.
too much. But when it comes to morality and ethics, I believe, at least on divine command theory, it's not a command is not something is not good because merely God has a subjective preference for it, but rather he commands certain things because of his character, because of his kind of character. Sorry, the kind of character that he has as well. So there isn't only his preference, but also his character working to make a particular commandment good or not, or obligatory or not.
I have a question.
Sure.
If you say that, then do you not run into the same problem with Hume and prescriptivism? That if it's just how this guy's character is and he has no prescriptive capacity with his own nature, then how would one derive an ought from that is? If it's just the case that God is like this and it is his nature, then you run into the same problem.
Oh, like, are you asking why ought we obey God just from the fact that he has certain particular character traits and he makes such a commandment?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's no prescriptivism there. It's just his nature. It's just what he is. Unless you say that he decided to be the way he is, and if he decided to be the way he is, then you do have the other side of it.
What's his name? Matthew Flanagan gave me a particularly good answer years back, and I still like it. Imagine for a minute that God is directly commanding you to do something, and you give him some kind of objection why you ought not to do something, or why you prefer not to do it. And now, anytime you would give a particular reason, God in his omnipotence could even make it such that by the standard or criteria you're giving for not doing the commandment, it would be in your better interest to actually do the commandments. So if there is therefore no rational reason to disobey, then the rational thing to do would be to obey, if that helps.
No, I don't see how that follows, honestly.
Is that rational morality or normative morality?
Because an almighty God could actually give you a reason that doesn't rationally follow, but because he is almighty, he could convince you that this is rational to follow. If you understand what I mean. So he's overriding your rationality.
What he's doing is what he's doing is he's letting you dictate he's letting you provide the reasons why you are going down a particular path, and a fortiori he's giving you better reasons, or he's giving you better reason based off of your criteria to obey the commandment.
But we have examples in the Bible where this didn't happen. So basically, God overrided the rationality of persons.
I mean, I'd rather not attack the God from the Bible right now. I mean, we can, right?
But he gave persons like the Pharaoh of what he let the Jews go on. He overrided his free will, so to speak. He gave him reasons to override his own rationality, so to speak. To come to a different conclusion.
That's not what I'm getting at. Not determining your mind to act in a certain way. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you believe in X because of Y, then you should believe in. If you believe in A because of B, then I should convince you that you should believe in C for greater reason based off of the fact that you are giving A as your justification. Here's something that's actually very interesting that you could do in logic. If I was to say cats have 3 legs, that's actually true. Now, of course, you might say, no, cats have 4 legs. Yes, that is also true. A fortiori, because they have 4 legs, you can make an even better case that they have 3 legs, because 3 is contained within 4. That's kind of what I'm getting at. If you want to take a particular set of action, let's say, I want to do this because it'll make me happier. God can say, well, if you do follow my commandment, you'll be even more happier based off of the criteria you've given me.
But
You know,
wouldn't you say that that an all-powerful God could convince you that an irrational action, well, irrational before God does that. In your opinion, it would be irrational, but he could make you so that this action could seem to be rational.
So let's clear up some terms here because I don't want to equivocate. When you say make, like if you mean by determining, I suppose, but that's not a moral action at that point. That's just you doing something. In terms of, but if you mean, could he give me a reason to do something irrational? Then I don't believe he, by definition, he couldn't, because if he's giving you a reason, then by definition it is irrational. Someone could give you a bad reason for doing something, but to accept it isn't you being irrational. It's just you not. It's just you not reasoning about something properly.
Oh, okay. Could God give you a bad reason to follow up with an action that is followed up based on that bad reason, but based on that bad reason you follow up with a rational action followed on that bad reason?
I mean,
Could,
bad reasons.
could an almighty God give you a bad reason and convince you that that bad reason is actually a good reason to follow up on?
No, and for good reason. This is a God who is if this is a God who is omnipotent, he has all knowledge, and in doing so, he is not a bad thinker. He has all the reasons in the world. He has all the means of the world at his disposal. It would be kind of imperfect of him to do so.
But you yourself have no idea about why it. If he gives you a reason and you on your own would say, well, that's actually a bad reason, but you would also be compelled to say, well, God is omniscient and he has perfect knowledge, and he could have a good reason to suggest to you to do act X, let's say, and act X seems to be to you yourself very badly. There is no good justification to do act X, but in God's perfect view of all things, act X makes perfect sense. So you wouldn't even have a basis to question if God tells you do act X.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure at the point you're trying to get across for a few reasons. One, it's either a good reason or it's not. Never mind the agent. Two, the reason, the justification for taking a particular action isn't God, it's you. God is just giving what's called an a fortiori justification, which is if you are doing something because of A, then on the basis of A, you have greater reason to obey God's commandment than not. That's all I'm saying. And
okay, using your standard, where did this ever happen in the Bible? Where somebody said, I have greater reason to disobey God than to not obey Him.
I have greater reason to obey rather than disobey, you mean? A couple of things. One, that's an argument from some. One, I'm not a Protestant. I don't believe in sola scriptura. So that's not a good objection for me. Two, there are a lot of religious beliefs I hold that aren't in the Bible. So as an example, I believe in the infallibility of the Pope. That's not something that's not a belief I base upon the Bible. That's a belief I base upon Catholic tradition. I don't believe another thing. I believe that there's 72 books in the biblical text. That's a doctrine I hold to, but there's no place in the Bible that lists all the books of the Bible. So there's that as well. It's particularly bad and egregious standard that only Protestants would take seriously.
I think you're kind of either you're dodging the question or you're throwing out red herrings. The problem
No.
here is the
The
problem.
question I'm saying, the basis of your question is flawed. Your suggestion is, where in the Bible does it say this? My response is nowhere, but who cares? It doesn't
Okay.
need to be in the Bible.
Oh, well, that's okay. That's an interesting.
He's Catholic. All Catholics.
admittance there.
It's
Catholics.
Catholic.
You know.
He's a Catholic. He
It's
doesn't.
a word.
He's
It's a
not-
word which.
So
It's a word which
Well,
covers
I'm
many.
an ex-Catholic, so I kind of understand where it's coming from.
So I'll
You
be
should know
I'll
that.
be ending this Hangouts really soon, and I just wanted to point out that this was not the point of the Hangout. I really didn't intend this to be theist versus atheist, challenge versus apologetics, debate on theology.
I'm sorry.
But yeah, it went down that way, so never mind. There was one thing that you mentioned at some point, which kind of made me curious, and there's a question that I've wanted to ask for a long time. I was a Catholic, and you've said something that there is a doctrine that there's a statement from the Catholic Church that nobody's in hell yet. That no person is in hell. So just related to that, my understanding was that there is no hell or heaven yet. That's a colloquial, like, civilian term, because the people who are dead, and they're just dead. And when the revelation comes, they will be risen, and then they will be judged at Judgment Day, and then they will go either to hell or to heaven.
Oh, you're confused. Yeah. This is easily clarifiable. In terms of when I say the Catholic Church doesn't say anyone's in hell, what I mean to say is there are people in hell. I don't doubt this, but the Catholic Church doesn't say who they are. We only know that they are. There are particular saints who have confessed that there are people in hell. I believe that, but no one said that. But I don't believe the Catholic Church backs up that any particular person is there. But I do recall one saint saying Martin Luther is burning in hell, which makes me kind of laugh. But
that's not the question. I wasn't asking about whether somebody is in hell or not.
Okay.
I was asking. I was. My question is about the Book of Revelation, the Judgment Day, the day when the dead will be risen from the grave and judged.
Right. In terms of that, what's being conflated is heaven and the new heaven. There are saints in heaven currently. These are souls that are with God, but they are unembodied. They are waiting upon the resurrection of the dead, and after that comes the new earth. And after that comes the new earth, where there'll be a heavenly Jerusalem, and this is where we're going to reside for all eternity, because heaven and earth become one. Right now, though, we are
second paradise, right?
Exactly. And in terms of hell, hell is going to remain the same. Hell exists now, and it will exist then. It's only at that time, though, when all sinners will be in hell, rather than only a subset of them.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I think that this will be a good time.
It's been interesting. It's been deep. It's been boring.
Yes.
That's life. That's life, isn't it?
Exactly the conversation I was looking for. Boring as hell.
Right now.
Thank you very much, Barney. I mean, you have somehow accumulated the dream team of Hangouts, in my opinion.
Okay, I'm Michael Jordan.
Scotty Pippen.
I did Scotty
I love
Pippen.
you still. I love you still,
He's
Simon.
already got that there.
Actually, can it be Larry Bird?
Well, I should say the dream team except Stewart. you know, you can drop him.
All right.
Otherwise,
Anyway,
I love all the people who are in the hangout. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much.
exactly. The whole panel, I agree with what Tonton said. This is just about my dream panel for my first hangout. And thank you all for coming and doing your best. And to anyone watching, see you next time.